Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a time when the stars mirrored on still waters, when the moon spilled light across black canals, and when the hum of insects was broken only by the soft splash of a paddle slicing through lake water. You're not in a dream, but you might as well be. You're in Tenochtitlan, the glittering water world capital of the Aztec Empire, where the land floats, the crops float, and honestly, your chance of surviving as a tourist is about the only thing that doesn't float. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment with your location and local time. Always love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're gliding into the heart of the Valley of Mexico, where the great Lake Texcoco once shimmered like a silver platter ringed with volcanoes. You can feel the air shifting around you, cool, humid, laced with the smell of wet earth, roasted maize, and distant wood smoke. The canoe beneath you barely rocks as your guide, a local farmer with arms like wet tree trunks and a face carved from decades of sun, steers you toward what looks like a floating garden. Except it's not floating. Not really. It's a chinampa, something between a man-made island and a miracle. You try to focus, but your modern brain keeps short-circuiting. You want to ask, how does it float without floating? Is it a raft? Is it a barge? Did they just dump mud until it stacked into something useful? The answer, frustratingly, is sort of all of the above. But let's back up. This city isn't supposed to exist. The Mexica people, the ones we now call Aztecs, fled here after getting kicked around the valley by more powerful tribes. They were the underdogs, the you can't sit with us of Mesoamerican geopolitics. So naturally, they built their capital in the middle of a freaking lake. Not on the shore. In it. Why? Because legend said their god Huitzilopochtli told them to find an eagle eating a snake while perched on a cactus. Spoiler, the cactus was on a tiny island in Lake Texcoco. Either divine sign or very questionable real estate advice, depending on how spiritually open you are. And so Tenochtitlan was born like Venice. If Venice had more human sacrifice and fewer pigeons as you float through the night, you notice how the air holds a kind of quiet tension. It's not peaceful, not entirely. There's a rhythm to it, croaking frogs, rustling leaves, the occasional distant splash like someone or something falling in. This city doesn't sleep, not really, because when you live on a lake, time is measured in paddles and planting, not hours and minutes. And in Tenochtitlan, the city moves as silently as the lake it rides. The chinampas stretch out before you, like neat rows in a flooded dream. They aren't just gardens. They're living infrastructure. Long, rectangular plots stitched together with reeds, mud, willow roots, and a lifetime of backbreaking labor. Each is hemmed in with woven fences of junco reeds, its soil dredged from the nutrient-rich lakebed and layered until it holds shape. And between these strips, canals, navigation routes, highways made for paddles, not wheels. And don't let the calm fool you, this city of water is bustling. At sunrise, the canals fill with canoes ferrying produce, flowers, fish, and gossip from one end of the empire to another. You won't hear honking horns here, just the occasional shouted insult in the waddle and the steady, almost hypnotic slap of paddle against water. But tonight it's just you, the dark water, and the ghost of an empire that once glowed like obsidian in moonlight. The temperature drops slightly. You wrap your cloak tighter, not that you're really cold, but the eeriness is starting to settle in. This isn't just farming. This is survival architecture. Chinampas aren't static. They require constant care. You dig trenches, dredge, mud, reinforce barriers. You plant crops in cycles so the soil doesn't get lazy. And every now and then, you pull up a skull. Because yes, sometimes the lake gives you a reminder. You're living in a city built on both flowers and bones. Historians still argue whether chinampa should be classified as aquaculture, agriculture, or straight-up magic. What's agreed upon is their efficiency. These plots could produce 7 harvests a year. That's not a typo, 7. In a time when most of the world was lucky to squeeze out 2. The Aztecs didn't just farm. They engineered an ecological machine so sustainable it makes modern vertical farming look like a child's science project glued together with hope and Pinterest boards. And it wasn't just maize, beans, and squash, the Mesoamerican Holy Trinity. You had chilies that made your eyes water, herbs that numbed toothaches, flowers that didn't just smell good, but doubled as tax payments. Yes, you heard that right. Flower tax. You'll get to that one later. Right. Now focus on the scent, earthy, vegetal, rich with decomposing waterweeds. You're smelling centuries of innovation. Here's your quirky fact for the night. The Aztecs used to stabilize their chinampas with awot trees, a kind of willow that loves wet feet and stubbornly grows wherever you don't want it to. It's like the dandelion of aquatic engineering. Plant a few of those bad boys at the corners, and boom, your mud island suddenly becomes a bit less suicidal. And while we're here, have you heard of the axolotl? That little pink amphibian with a face like a permanently surprised emoji. It lived in these waters, still does, somehow. The Aztecs saw it as sacred. Scientists today see it as the poster child of regenerative biology. Meanwhile, it just swims around, unfazed, looking like it's about to drop a lo-fi mixtape. You breathe in. Exhale. The boat rocks gently. It's hard to imagine the empire now. All you see are patches of darkness and reeds brushing against the sky. But once, this was the backbone of an economy. A city sustained not by distant farms or overland caravans, but by floating food machines. A paddle's length away, farmers here weren't lowly peasants. They were technologists, hydrological artists, the original climate engineers. And while you might roll your eyes at that, remember, your last avocado toast came from an irrigation system that's probably less efficient than what these folks built out of twigs and hope. The night deepens. Somewhere, an oar hits a submerged log with a dull thud. Your guide mutters something about a spirit. You don't ask. You don't want to know. Instead, you lean back. Let the gentle current pull your mind into stillness. You're floating over a lost world that fed millions, flowered endlessly, and slipped beneath the surface like so many forgotten empires. You drift closer now, squinting at the edges of the chinampa as your canoe nudges gently against its side. You reach out, half expecting your hand to pass through it like a ghost's dream, but no, it's solid, surprisingly solid. Beneath your fingertips is a layer of moist soil, surprisingly firm and warm, packed down like a stubborn brownie that refuses to crumble. The surface squelches just a little under pressure, held firm by centuries of careful layering, binding, and brute force. Ingenuity. This is no raft. This is architecture born from desperation, climate, and a profound refusal to starve in a lake. The Aztecs didn't just slap mud on a log and hope. They engineered an entire agricultural system by stacking mud, reeds, decaying matter, and sticks with the kind of care you usually reserve for assembling IKEA furniture, with clearer instructions too. First, they drive wooden stakes, usually from fast-growing, water-loving trees, down into the shallow lake bed to outline a rectangular plot. Think of it as fencing off your future floating garden. Then came the layers mud dredged from the nutrient-dense lake bottom, mixed with decayed vegetation, algae, and occasionally, some very reluctant fish. These layers were repeatedly stacked and shaped until they rose above the water's surface like little earthy barges. Along the edges they planted awot trees, which grew quickly and anchored the whole mass with an aggressive tangle of roots that laughed in the face of erosion. Over time, these trees formed natural hedges between plots and created shady, Microclimates that were perfect for certain crops. That's right, these people built floating gardens with built-in windbreaks, automatic irrigation via capillary action, and rotating crops long before someone coined the term permaculture. On a podcast, you kneel and pick up a handful of the soil. It smells rich, loamy, almost alive. It's hard to believe something so fertile started in a swamp. But then again, so did Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs were nothing if not stubborn about making bad. Real estate sparkle. The plot you're on now grows maize tall, whispering stalks that brush against each other like old gossiping women in the breeze. Between them, beans spiral up the stalks in green helixes while squash creeps low along the soil, its broad leaves creating living mulch. The Three Sisters. Corn provides a stalk, beans feed nitrogen into the soil, squash shades out weeds. It's an agricultural polyamory that works surprisingly well. Occasionally, you spot clusters of chili peppers glowing like little red warnings, or the purple flash of amaranth, a grain that once fed warriors and now fuels health smoothies in LA. You smile. The more things change, right? But here's the weird part. The soil never seems to dry out. Because it doesn't. The canals constantly feed moisture up through the base, acting like a natural wick system. During droughts, the Aztecs would simply deepen canals and scoop more muck to spread across the plots. During floods, they relied on carefully planned barriers and plant roots to hold the islands together like soggy little fortresses. Historians still argue whether chinampas count as true hydroponics or just the most overachieving swamp agriculture in history. But here's the deal, no one else on Earth, at that time, had figured out how to grow 7 crops a year on artificial islands. Europe was still debating crop rotation. China had rice paddies, but nothing this modular. The chinampa system wasn't just clever, it was miles ahead of its time, both literally and agriculturally. And about those fish, the canals weren't just for canoe traffic. They were full of protein-rich extras: fish, shrimp, aquatic insects that turned your local gardener into a part-time fisherman. Some chinampa farmers kept ducks or turkeys too, letting them roam the plots to fertilize the soil and peck off pests. One farmer, probably high on fermented pulque and ambition, even tried to farm frogs for meat. It didn't go viral. But the axolotls, those bizarre regenerating salamanders we mentioned, they were abundant here, scooped up and grilled like water sausages with legs, and they weren't just dinner. Some healers used them in potions, claiming they soothed coughs, calmed nightmares, or cured heartbreak. You're not sold on that last one. But floating on these waters, surrounded by moonlit crops and softly quacking ducks, you can believe in a world where frogs might fix you. You glance toward the distant skyline. Back then, Tenochtitlan's temples would have pierced the dark like jagged fangs, their painted steps gleaming in the torchlight. But out here, beyond the ceremonial core, life was quieter. Farmers rose before the sun, slipping out in canoes. While the city still slept, they'd glide past floating flower beds, through water avenues lined with willow and maize, their paddles carving ripples into a mirrored lake. And when they reached their chinampas, they'd begin the daily ritual of tending, digging, and muttering curses at raccoons. Yes, raccoons, or something very raccoon adjacent. Whatever they were, they loved beans and hated boundaries. You see, every chinampa wasn't isolated, it was part of a vast grid. Think Manhattan meets Waterworld. The entire southern zone of the lake was a patchwork of plots, each with its own crops, compost heap, and canoe dock. Some were passed down for generations, others were rented from nobles or the empire itself. And if you thought landlords today were bad, imagine being fined in maize for failing to dredge your assigned canal section. Because that was a thing. The Mexica had water taxes. Quirky fact time. Some chinampas were dedicated entirely to growing flowers, not for food, but for tribute. High-ranking nobles, temples, and even warrior lodges demanded regular shipments of marigolds, dahlias, and fragrant herbs. Flower farming became such a prestige game that entire neighborhoods specialized in it. And where prestige goes, pressure follows. You didn't just lose face if your marigolds wilted, you could lose land, titles, or worse. A bad harvest meant explaining to a priest why their sacred festival had fewer petals than last year. And priests, as you'll see later, were not known for their chill. The canoe glides silently again, brushing through reeds that whisper like dry voices. Somewhere in the dark, a frog croaks and is immediately answered by another, possibly irritated. You lie back now, watching the stars flicker through sparse clouds. The night is warm, wrapped around you like a damp blanket. It's not just that the Aztecs built floating farms. It's that they made water itself bend to their will. Where most civilizations feared wetlands, they saw potential. Where others tried to drain swamps, the Mexica farmed them. They didn't conquer nature. They married it, flaws and all dot, and beneath it all is the hum of maintenance. Every week, every day, you patch walls, trim roots, scrape sludge. Nothing is ever finished. It's a system that demands love through labor, and it gave back sevenfold. If you're starting to feel sleepy now, it might be the rhythm, or the soft splash of water, or maybe the slow realization that even in a world of gods and gold and war, the Aztecs knew the real empire was dirt. You wake before the city does. Or rather, you drift into awareness while the mist still curls over the canal like a sleepy serpent, half-formed and clinging to the water's warmth. The light is soft and gray, barely seeping through the clouds that gather over the eastern horizon like gossip. Somewhere a paddle dips once, twice. A bird whistles with alarming confidence for this hour. And you, nestled in the back of a canoe, now drifting lazily through a corridor of water, begin to understand the sheer madness of what's around you. This city, this empire, it rose not on land, but on a lakebed. Not exactly a prime real estate choice, especially for a civilization with zero steel, no wheels, and limited patience for land that sinks. And yet, the Mexica built not just a settlement, but the capital of an empire, here Tenochtitlan. You squint at the distant skyline where temples would have once pierced the heavens with their stepped silhouettes. It's easy to forget, in the romantic murk of history, that this glittering city of water was once a soggy patch of inhospitable swamp. Picture it, a few islands barely poking out of the water, surrounded by brackish waves and unfriendly neighbors. And into this stepped a ragged, displaced group of Nahua-speaking migrants who, legend says, had wandered for generations following a divine vision. The eagle, the snake, the cactus. You've heard this story, probably tattooed on someone's lower back or immortalized on a national flag. But here's what they don't tell you. When the Mexica finally found that eagle on its prickly throne, it wasn't a happy ending. It was a logistical nightmare. The ground was marshy. The water was saline. There was no farmland, no timber, no easy way to defend against raids unless your enemies were allergic to mildew. In short, it was the worst Airbnb booking in the valley of Mexico. So what did they do? They adapted. They turned mud into currency, reeds into architecture, and water into both shield and weapon. They began constructing chinampas almost immediately, at first just to feed themselves, then to feed an army, and eventually to sustain a growing empire. The early versions were crude, bundled reeds packed with mud, tethered to poles, barely stable enough to stand on. But necessity breeds brilliance. The Mexica watched, experimented, borrowed techniques from earlier cultures like the Texcoco, who had been fiddling with lake farming long before the Aztecs claimed it as their signature move. They improved the drainage, fortified the edges, and discovered how to stack layers of mud and compost like a 7-layer bean dip that could grow your dinner. It wasn't long before they realized this wasn't just survival, it was domination. Because the more chinampas they built, the more people they could feed. The more people they fed, the more warriors they could field. And soon, their swampy stronghold transformed into the launchpad of conquest. By the time the Spanish showed up, Tenochtitlan was pulsing with more than 200,000 residents, surrounded by a network of canals, causeways, and aqueducts that made it look like a watery jewel. Dropped in a mountain valley, visitors gawked at its gleaming palaces and humming markets, its orderly streets and symmetry, and most of all, its improbable success. It wasn't just a city, it was a machine. A floating, blooming, blood-drenched engine of empire. And at its heart, the chinampa. You lean forward now, craning to see the layout of the land or lake. The chinampas spread outward from the city's core like veins. Rectangles of green, striped by narrow canals, dotted with trees that sway gently in the morning air. Each chinampa is claimed, worked, and protected. Some belong to noble families who rent them out like tiny agricultural Airbnbs. Others are temple-controlled, their harvests offered to the gods. Still others are worked by free farmers technically. Commoners, but wielding the kind of quiet influence that comes from feeding a metropolis. Farming here isn't peasantry. It's prestige. A skilled chinampero knows how to balance the soil's moisture, when to dredge, when to rotate, when to let the plot rest, and when to bribe the local official with a bushel of extra beans to ignore a few overgrown canal weeds. Because make no mistake, this system came with rules. Dredging schedules, harvest quotas, tribute obligations. Fail to maintain your chinampa, and you could lose it. Fail to deliver your required maize, and someone in a jaguar pelt might come. Ask why. Historians still debate whether the chinampa system was fully egalitarian or just another cog in a highly stratified empire. Some argue that it gave ordinary citizens economic mobility. If you could grow enough, you could rise. Others point out that most of the surplus went up the pyramid, feeding temples, military lodges, and the insatiable stomachs of nobility. Either way, the system worked. Worked so well, in fact, that when courts arrived, he mistook the place for a vision. Or maybe a fever dream. To him, it looked like Venice. To the Mexica, it looked like home, damp, stubborn, productive. Back in your boat, the guide points to the water and mutters something about teeptate. You peer over and see a man waist-deep in the canal, dredging up gray mud with a flat basket. Teeptate is mineral-rich sediment scooped from the bottom and spread over the chinampa's surface to replenish nutrients. This process isn't glamorous. It's wet, cold, and smells like regret, but it's necessary. Without constant input of teeptate and decayed vegetation, the chinampa's soil depletes. The system is sustainable, but only through effort. Like a marriage. Or sourdough. Here's your quirky fact of the section. Some chinampa farmers used to sing to their crops. Not for yield, but to mark rhythm while they worked. A kind of agricultural chant that helped them remember planting cycles, warn off birds, or pass time in the solitude of the reeds. Imagine singing to your squash in the middle of a misty canal while ducks look on, unimpressed. Strangely, the crops didn't seem to mind. The sun begins to rise in earnest now, its light cutting across the water like a golden blade. Shadows retreat, birds stir, the city begins to wake. And you, adrift in this water-woven world, begin to realize that Tenochtitlan wasn't just built on chinampas, it depended on them. They were the lungs of the city, breathing food into its markets, flowers into its rituals, and rhythm into its daily grind. Without them, the empire collapses. With them, it flourished. At least for a time. Your stomach growls quietly, maybe from the scent of roasted maize drifting lazily across the lake, or maybe from watching the farmer ahead deftly harvest bright green ears of corn with the kind of care usually reserved for handling newborns, or very delicate burritos. He's already loaded his canoe with squash. a bundle of amaranth stalks, and what looks suspiciously like a basket of wriggling insects. Don't panic, those are probably ahwotl, the edible eggs of aquatic insects, once revered as delicacies. The Aztecs weren't squeamish about protein sources, especially when farming in a wetland. You, though, might need a moment. Still, the agricultural system unfolding around you is starting to look more like a closed-loop miracle than any conventional farm. You see, chinampas didn't just produce food, they produced an ecosystem. And that ecosystem was so wildly effective that modern scientists are still trying to reverse engineer it. Picture this: a chinampa filled with the three sisters corn, beans, and squash all doing their tri-crop tango. Then add chiles, tomatoes, and herbs like epazote and amaranth. Now imagine ducks paddling through the canals, fertilizing water and gobbling up mosquito larvae. Add fish in the canals, whose waste becomes liquid gold for the soil. You start to realize this isn't farming. This is nature on a performance-enhancing drug. And it all starts with that black, pungent muck at the bottom of the lake rich, with decomposed algae, fish parts, and whatever else the water claims and forgets. So what exactly did the Aztecs eat with all this produce? Turns out, a lot. Their diet was shockingly varied and mostly plant-based before that was a trend. Maize was the backbone of every meal, ground into masa for tortillas, tamales, or fermented slightly to make a sour porridge called atoa. Beans, rich in protein and fiber, were cooked into stews or mashed into pastes. Squash added calories and sweetness, while chiles spiced things up with enough fire to make your eyelids sweat. And yes, there was meat, but not in the way most modern diets imagine. Large mammals were scarce in Mesoamerica. Instead, protein came from birds, amphibians, and an impressive variety of edible insects. Turkey was the main domesticated meat. Along with dogs, yes, the Mexica raised the Loetzcuintlas, hairless dogs often eaten during feasts. But insects? Those were the hidden stars. Chapulins, toasted grasshoppers, and ahwotl, those little bug eggs scraped off reeds like caviar, made regular appearances in markets and kitchens. Nutritious, sustainable, and crunchy, basically the ancient world's answer to flamin'. Hot Cheetos, except less red dust on your fingers. Let's not forget the drinks. The Mexica had no shortage of fermented options. Pulque, made from the sap of the maguey plant, was a thick, milky beverage with a reputation somewhere between beer and yogurt. It was sacred, restricted to elders and priests, though that didn't stop a few chinampa farmers from sneaking a gourdful before sunrise. And cacao, that wasn't sweet. It was bitter, foamy, spiced with chili, and considered a divine beverage reserved for nobility. You wouldn't find it at Starbucks. But if you were lucky, you might trade your surplus squash for a single bitter sip at the market. That market Tlatelolco wasn't far from here. You try to imagine it. Thousands of people gathering daily, each vendor offering something grown on their floating plot. A place buzzing not with traffic, but with paddles and bartering voices. Canoes unloading flower garlands, baskets of beans, freshwater shrimp still twitching in the shade. The smell would have been intoxicating earth. Spice, sweat, and maize. You think about what it would take to run a chinampa successfully. It's more than digging and planting. You have to time your plantings carefully. Beans in early spring, maize staggered through summer, squash woven in between to prevent weeds. Then there's the maintenance: weekly dredging, root trimming, and rotating where the muck gets laid. If you don't compost well, your plot sours. If you over-fertilize, you lose everything to mold. There's a rhythm here. A pulse you feel not through clocks, but through soil texture and bird migration. No wonder the Aztecs didn't just farm, they ritualized it. Farming was sacred. Maize wasn't just food, it was divine. The gods had, according to myth, created humans from ground maize dough. So when you planted corn, you weren't just growing dinner, you were participating in a cycle of rebirth. You were In a way, baking the next generation of your people. Historians still argue whether this religious framing of agriculture was top-down propaganda or grassroots belief. Did the state mythologize maize to maintain social control, or did the people genuinely feel reverence for each kernel? The answer is probably both. But the result was the same: intense respect for food, for soil, for the chinampa itself. That's why offerings were often buried at the start of planting seasons. Bits of blood, feathers, sometimes even hair. Not for the nutrients, but for the gods. Because in the Aztec worldview, the gods didn't just hand over blessings. They loaned them. And you paid rent in sweat, ritual, and occasionally, your own skin. The boat rocks a little as your guide slows near a particularly dense patch of plots. You can see the difference between well-kept chinampas and the neglected ones. The good ones have clear canal edges, orderly rows, tall corn. The failing ones sag at the corners, their tree anchors wilting, their soil crusted with mold or algae. You ask what happens when a chinampa fails. The guide says nothing at first, then shrugs. Sometimes it's abandoned. Sometimes another farmer buys it, reclaims it, and starts again. Sometimes it sinks. The lake doesn't forgive sloppiness. You nod. Farming on water isn't just technique. It's vigilance. Here's your quirky tidbit of the hour. Some chinampa farmers were rumored to sleep on their plots in shifts, especially during high theft seasons. That's right, crop theft was a thing, especially with flowers. You might wake up and find your marigolds missing, sold to a priest by sunrise. To combat this, farmers sometimes tied rattles to their perimeter trees, or even trained ducks to honk when disturbed. Security systems, Aztec style. And if someone was caught, consequences ranged from fines to public shaming. You could lose your right to farm, or worse, be sent to dig canal muck for a temple crew. You try not to imagine that punishment involving mosquitoes the size of your dreams. You lay back again, resting your head on the boat's edge, eyes following the low sweep of birds overhead. Herons, egrets, maybe even a hawk circling above the mist. This place hums with life, not just because of the animals, but because of the relentless human pulse keeping it all in motion. It's hard not to admire the quiet genius of it all. These weren't floating gardens as novelty. They were necessary, functional, resilient, the backbone of a city that rose from a swamp, challenged the continent, and for a time, ruled with flowered fists and obsidian swords. Your paddle dips again, slicing a V into the still, silver water as you slide past another cluster of chinampas. And now you're getting curious. How exactly do they stay this perfect? You've seen what happens to mud when left alone. It sags. It splits. It collapses into something that resembles regret with worms in it. But these chinampas? They're sturdy, geometric, self-contained worlds, all order and fertility. The answer, as always in Aztec engineering, comes down to relentless maintenance and an almost spiritual patience for repetition. You start noticing the patterns. Every few meters, another farmer is out there, shirt tied around his waist, legs caked in sludge up to the knee, driving long poles into the lake bed. These poles, sometimes called plachinoli stakes, though that name is debated, form the skeleton of every chinampa. They outline the perimeter, support the reeds, and hold the plot together. Over time, they decay and must be replaced, which means that building a chinampa isn't a one-and-done deal. It's a long-term relationship, complete with periodic mud therapy. But beyond the poles, what really holds a chinampa together is the weave. Picture this: layers of woven reeds, vines, aquatic grasses like tuliol, laid out like a basket under your soil. This acts like rebar in concrete, but biodegradable. It breathes, it shifts. It allows water to pass but keeps the precious topsoil from slipping into the canal every time it rains. Above that comes the dredged lake muck, called shiatlali. dark and rich and gross in that way. Compost is always a little gross, no matter how many urban farming blogs tell you otherwise. Farmers throw in chopped plant remains, fish bones, and even shredded bark. The mix breaks down, replenishing nutrients and creating a living foundation. You can almost hear the chinampa sigh with relief each time it gets fed. What's fascinating is how farmers learn to balance this system over centuries. If the reed base rots too fast, the whole plot sags. If you over-dredge muck, the canal gets too shallow, disrupting canoe routes and causing flood risk. So like ancient accountants in loincloths, they tracked every action, what was planted, how much silt was added, when the tree roots needed pruning. That's right, those awo trees we keep bumping into, they need trimming too. Left unchecked, their roots will dominate a chinampa, sucking up too much water, destabilizing the walls, and sometimes even collapsing the whole thing. So every few seasons, a chinampa would climb up there with a stone blade or obsidian hatchet and give those trees a gentle haircut. Kind of like landscaping your farm's structural skeleton while also trying not to fall into a canal full of tadpoles. And don't even get started on pest control. There were no chemical pesticides here, no branded bottles of death to squirt at aphids. Instead, farmers used intercropping mixing crops to confuse pests and attract beneficial insects. They set up decoy plants at canal edges to lure the bugs away. They sometimes even kept toads around as pest patrol, letting the grumpy amphibians lurk under squash leaves and gobble up whatever wiggled. This wasn't organic farming. This was pre-organic farming, like the grandfather of sustainable agriculture, sitting on a pile of rotting reeds and looking smug. Historians still argue whether the complexity of chinampa maintenance was a barrier to entry for new farmers or whether it created a tight-knit culture of knowledge sharing. Some say you needed years of apprenticeship to manage a plot properly, passed down through families like sacred recipes. Others believe there was a more communal approach, neighbors helping neighbors, especially during festival seasons when planting had to be coordinated to avoid the horror of mismatched bloom cycles. Both theories might be true, depending on the neighborhood. What's certain is that the maintenance cycle was constant. You weren't just farming. You were engaged in hydrological choreography. Forget tending a garden. This was stage managing. A wetland. The man in the next canoe is carrying what looks like a bundle of woven mats. You recognize them now not for lounging, but for wall reinforcement. Farmers would wrap the edges of chinampas with woven reed mats, weighted with stones, to resist erosion. These mats degraded over time and had to be replaced regularly. You think of modern homeowners dreading roof repairs, then look at this guy cheerfully tossing his mat bundle onto a pile of waterlogged soil and whistling as he begins the process. You want to ask him why he does it. But maybe the answer is already around you. This floating patch of dirt, stubbornly staying afloat through sheer determination and willow roots, is his inheritance, his pantry, his entire economy. Quirky fact of the hour: the Aztecs had a sort of floating garbage disposal system. Canals served not just for irrigation and transport, but also for waste. Organic waste, that is. Leftover maize husks, bean pods, dead fish, plant trimmings, all thrown into the canal. Over time it all decomposed, and farmers dredged it back up as fertilizer. You're basically looking at a centuries-old compost loop where the water was both the delivery system and the buffet. If you were a microbe in Aztec times, you were living your best life. As your canoe skims the surface, the water sloshes gently against the reeds, a rhythm that starts to lull you. Again, you begin to see how hypnotic the routine must have been. Pull the canoe, dredge the muck, layer the soil, water the corn, trim the trees, check the roots, pull the weeds, harvest the squash, repeat. It's a rhythm of survival, a beat past, down by calloused hands and bent backs. And yet, there's beauty in it. The kind of satisfaction that comes from managing complexity with elegance. But it wasn't always smooth. Seasonal changes brought chaos. In summer, the rains turned canals into rivers. Water levels rose so high they sometimes overflowed the chinampas, drowning crops and washing away soil. In dry spells, the water level dropped too low, leaving the plot stranded and the canals clogged with algae. Farmers had to constantly adapt. Some built low walls around their chinampas to hold water during dry seasons. Others planted certain crops like chia and amaranth that could survive fluctuating moisture levels. Flexibility was key. If you couldn't pivot, your chinampa turned into a soggy coffin for your food dot. And if the environment wasn't punishing enough, there was also competition. Farmers often found themselves in disputes over canal access, water rights, and silt usage. Who dredged from where? Who blocked a waterway with an unlicensed canoe dock? The city had officials for this. Imagine a municipal water patrol armed with obsidian clipboards and an aggressive love for rules. Bureaucrats floated from plot to plot, checking canal widths, verifying harvest reports, issuing fines. Your chinampa had better be up to code, or you might find yourself doing temple cleaning duty instead of harvesting chilies. Still, the system endured. Because for all its mud and maintenance, a chinampa offered something precious: autonomy. A farmer controlled their own food, their own space. They weren't subject to the whims of distant landlords or drought-prone fields. Here, surrounded by water, they could thrive, so long as they kept working, so long as the poles held, so long as the reeds kept weaving their underwater nets. And you're still floating, still watching, still wondering how something so muddy could be so beautiful. The wind shifts slightly now, a cool breeze threading through the reeds and fluttering your tunic as you drift past a chinampa that looks less like a farm and more like a laboratory, no, a machine. At first glance, it's the same patchwork rectangle as the others, with its anchoring trees and well-kept canals. But something about this one whispers order. Rows are planted with military precision. Canals are dredged to uniform depth. And in the center sits an elderly farmer on a reed mat, hands buried wrist-deep in soil, as if diagnosing the health of the earth by touch. You begin to realize this isn't just a garden, it's an ecological computer. The chinampa isn't a passive plot, it's a self-regulating system. The canals feed moisture into the soil through capillary action, yes, but they also function as passive temperature control. During hot days, water evaporates slowly, cooling the plants above. At night, the lake retains heat longer than open air, buffering the chill and protecting tender crops from frost. The plants thrive not despite the water, but because of it. You're starting to think this might be the original smart farm, just without the Wi-Fi and very few men named Chad trying to pitch it on LinkedIn. Every piece has a function. The tall alhu trees do more than anchor the soil. They block wind, provide shade, and drop organic matter that replenishes nutrients. Their roots sip water like straws, preventing the soil from waterlogging. Underneath the surface, those same roots form a dense, interlocking web that filters canal water, reducing sediment drift and even capturing stray bits of fertilizer before they can leach away. The whole thing is a feedback loop, a biome in rectangular form. And the farmer, he's not just planting, he's orchestrating. Managing water flow, soil structure, planting rotation, and even pest dynamics like a bearded Mozart in sandals and swamp mud. You watch him slice into the soil with a stone-bladed hoe, checking texture and adjusting mulch placement. This isn't casual gardening. This is diagnostics. The chinampa even supports its own microclimate. Humidity levels hover higher over the canals, encouraging fungal growth in beneficial areas and suppressing dust that might harm seedlings. Insects that lay their eggs in the reeds don't venture far inland, making natural pest zones along canal edges. Birds land, peck pests, and inadvertently fertilize the soil. Even the frogs are employees here, tiny croaking janitors who feast on mosquito larvae. The entire ecosystem is held in delicate tension, and the chinampa understands each thread like a conductor knows every violin in his orchestra. The farmer points to a cluster of orange marigolds blooming on one edge and mutters, something about them being guardian flowers. You realize he means it both spiritually and biologically. Marigolds are known to repel certain nematodes and insects, so their placement isn't just for show. Even the pretty parts are working overtime. Quirky fact break, there's some evidence that ancient chinampa farmers bred their own soil-enhancing worms, not earthworms, but aquatic oligoshakes that thrived in shallow canal silt. These little wrigglers sped up decomposition and aerated the soil like underwater rototillers. Some modern scientists suggest that they were intentionally introduced into specific dredging zones, then captured and seeded into low-yield chinampas. In other words, Aztec farmers may have invented protobiological engineering thousands of years before anyone in a lab coat dropped a pipette onto a petri dish. And here's where it gets quietly revolutionary. Unlike land-based agriculture, chinampas didn't cause widespread deforestation. In fact, they helped preserve wetlands by spreading cultivation across the lake rather than stripping hillsides or clearing forests. They recycled water, reused organic waste, and minimized erosion. The only major input was labor. Constant, sweat-soaked, ankle-deep labor. You see now why the empire invested so much in training farmers, and why chinampa knowledge was passed down like sacred scripture. A bad farmer could destroy a plot in a year. A good one could feed 100 people. That ratio? That's power. Historians still debate whether chinampas should be considered a form of engineered wetland, natural urban farming, or something entirely different, a hybrid we've never really classified properly. There are entire academic arguments about where to file them, ecological taxonomy, but no one denies their effectiveness. It's said that an acre of chinampa land could outproduce 3 acres of dry land farming in maize yield alone. That's without irrigation systems, without draft animals, without artificial fertilizers. Just mud, roots, and generations of unrelenting trial and error. It's farming at its most elegant and most exhausting. The farmer rises slowly now, brushing dirt off his knees. You see that his hands are thick, fingers wide, nails blunt from a lifetime of turning soil and knowing when to stop. He grabs a paddle and slides back into his canoe, leaving behind a plot so perfectly balanced you half expect it to hum like a tuning fork. As he passes you, he nods. It's not a greeting. It's an acknowledgement. You saw it. You understand now. This isn't magic. This is precision disguised as mud. But even machines can break down. Chinampas weren't immune to failure. Over time, soil nutrients depleted. The lake's hydrology shifted. Canals silted. Trees grew too greedy. Plots needed to be retired, rebuilt, rotated. Sometimes a chinampa would collapse entirely, its foundation eroded, its walls breached by a surge of water or a particularly hungry duck with no respect for boundaries. In those cases, farmers would strip the plot bare, let it rest submerged for a season or two, and then start the cycle again. Even now, you see one of those failed plots ahead, marked by sagging edges and a canopy of overgrown weeds. It's not dead, just dormant. Like a farmer's sigh taking root. And speaking of sighs, you lean back again, allowing your canoe to drift alongside a plot where sunflowers bob lazily in the breeze. The air smells green, fresh, and musty all at once. Somewhere nearby, someone is playing a wooden flute, and the notes skim across the water like dragonflies. The moment is almost too serene to believe. You're floating through an ancient agricultural system that still functions, still feeds, still resists the rules of gravity and good sense. And here's the kicker. Nobody patented it. Nobody turned it into a startup. It didn't need slogans or seed funding. It just Worked. You close your eyes and feel the canoe tilt gently beneath you. Water laps at the sides, birds chirp in the reeds, and beneath the surface, 1,000 microscopic processes unfold in perfect, silent sync. This isn't just a garden. It's a memory that grows, a machine that breathes, a miracle held together by roots, rhythm, and a refusal to give up. Your canoe turns sharply around a canal corner, and almost immediately, you feel it, the smell. Not the crisp, loamy scent of chinampa soil, or the gentle musk of wet reeds. No, this is the ripe, unmistakable aroma of swamp silt freshly dredged, and proudly drying in the sun, mixed with something just a little off, like fish that had dreams of becoming compost, but overslept. Ahead of you, a group of workers is waist-deep in black water, hauling up basketfuls of muck and flinging it expertly onto their plots with the practiced apathy of people who have done this 1,000 times. They're drenched, covered in streaks of lake bottom like they've just survived an exploding fondue pot of algae and ambition. Welcome to the less romantic, absolutely essential world of chinampa maintenance. This is the dredging crew. No one writes poems about them. But without them, the floating city sinks, literally. They're after teep tate and chiatlali again, the rich mud that feeds the soil. The canals don't just separate the plots. They're nutrient highways, seasonal depositories, and the Aztec Empire's answer to fertilizer production. Here's the process. You drag a flat-bottom basket to the canal bottom, scoop up the black gold, hoist it into your canoe, and transport it to your plot's edge. Then you slap it onto your chinampa in wet bricks, smoothing it into place with your hands or feet like frosting a very muddy cake. You do this over and over, every week, year after year. Want to skip a week? Sure, but your corn's going to look like it came from a post-apocalyptic snack bar. Your squash will sulk. Your beans will wither into disappointment. The soil, like the gods, demands sacrifice. Not in blood well, not always, but definitely in blisters, aching joints, and a new understanding of just how many mosquito bites a human being can collect before questioning life choices. And while you're at it, better keep an eye out for duck eggs. Ducks love the chinampa system. Too much. They sneak onto the plots at dawn, lay their eggs under squash leaves, and vanish. Some farmers treat the eggs as bonus protein. Others trade them at market. Still others blame ducks for crop damage and consider them egg-laying anarchists in feathers. One chinampero swears he caught a duck nibbling on his chili plants just for fun, not hunger, but spite. It's probably not true, but in a system this delicately balanced, every animal is either an ally or a saboteur, sometimes both before. Breakfast, quirky tidbit time. In certain neighborhoods of Tenochtitlan, silt theft became a recurring issue. That's right, mud crimes. In dry years, when the lake bed was lower and good dredging spots became scarce, rival farmers would sneak into each other's canal segments at night, scoop up baskets of prime muck, and redistribute it to their own plots like aquatic Robin Hoods, except they weren't stealing from the rich. They were stealing from anyone who happened to have compost that didn't smell like pure despair. The city responded by assigning canal wardens inspectors in canoes who patrolled popular dredging zones and recorded infractions on bark paper tablets. If caught, a thief could be fined a portion of their crop, docked canal access rights, or even publicly shamed with a necklace made of dead water weeds. Not painful, but deeply embarrassing. Imagine showing up to market wearing the ancient equivalent of a mud thief sandwich, bored while your competitors point and whisper. You begin to notice the rhythm of it all. One farmer pulls a net of aquatic weeds, water hyacinth, and algae lets them dry in the sun, then folds them into his compost. Another trims the roots of his awot trees, tossing the excess into the canal where it will eventually rot and become part of the system again. Everything loops. Nothing is wasted. Even weeds are drafted into service. They trap sediment, block wind, and when dried, can be turned into binding mats for repairing canal walls. It's like watching a perpetual motion machine made of hands, mud, and relentless optimism. And all of this before breakfast. But maintenance isn't just physical, there's paperwork too. Well, the Aztec version of it. Each farmer is expected to report crop yields, canal conditions, and dredging schedules to their Calpulli, the local neighborhood administrative unit. Calpulli leaders, in turn, send these reports up the chain to city officials. And the officials? They track everything. How many chinampas your family has. How much maize you produced. Whether your canal edge collapsed in the last flood. If your plot went fallow too long, they might reassign it. If your yield dropped, they'd want to know why. And heaven help you if you underreported your bean harvest and got caught. You might find your best canal access rerouted, or worse, reassigned to a more responsible neighbor. The state didn't mess around when it came to food security. Historians still argue whether this bureaucratic oversight created equity or just served to consolidate power among nobles and temples. Some claim the reporting system ensured fair distribution of labor and resources. Others point to how often tribute crops mysteriously ended up on temple grounds or noble tables. But one thing's clear, the city didn't trust farmers to self-govern entirely. Every chinampa was both a private garden and a state asset. You could eat from it, but you also had to produce from it. And in a good year, that pressure felt manageable. In a bad year, it felt like trying to grow squash in the shadow of a pyramid. Back on your boat, you drift by a young boy kneeling at the edge of a chinampa, gently scraping algae from the canal surface with a flat basket. His face is calm, eyes focused, movements precise. He's probably 10, maybe 11. And already, he's helping maintain the delicate balance of this floating system. You wonder if he even questions it, or if, like generations before him, he simply accepts that the family plot needs him, just as much as he needs it. That if the muck doesn't get dredged, the beans won't grow. If the beans don't grow, the maize fails. And if the maize fails, the market empties, the temple complains, and someone eventually shows up with a clipboard and questions. And speaking of markets, you hear faint voices in the distance. The daily canoe traffic is beginning. Farmers, traders, and city dwellers load their skiffs with produce and paddle toward the center. Boats wobble with baskets of squash, towers of flowers, chickens tied at the ankles. Even now, as the sun climbs higher, the maintenance never stops. Because in a city built on water and dreams, stability isn't a gift. It's a job. You blink slowly as the boat glides past another vibrant patch of chinampa, and now you're seeing less maize and squash, and a whole lot more color. Reds, oranges, purples bright, heady blooms swaying above the soil like a garden caught mid-laugh. Marigolds, dahlias, cosmos, and delicate clusters of cempasúchil glowing like little suns. This isn't a vegetable plot. This is a flower farm. And not just for the vibes, these blooms are political currency, spiritual fuel, and social performance rolled into petals and stems. Here, among the chinampas, flower farming isn't just allowed, it's demanded. The Aztecs were obsessed with flowers. No, not like give your girlfriend a bouquet obsessed. More like sacrifice a jaguar night to the gods, because your marigold harvest was late, obsessed. Flowers weren't just pretty, they were power. This particular patch belongs to a local Calpulli that specializes in tribute blooms. Their job? Grow massive quantities of ornamental and sacred flowers year-round and deliver them to temples, nobles, and ritual events. And you can bet those deliveries better be on time and freshly picked. Why? Because flowers were used in everything. Offerings, altars, feasts, dances, rituals, burial ceremonies, even political negotiations. A noble's gift wasn't complete without a garland. A priest wouldn't start a sacrifice without a flower crown, sometimes for the victim, sometimes for the god statue. It's hard to explain how tightly beauty and brutality were braided in Aztec ritual culture. But here in the chinampa system, the people knew beauty had to be cultivated, literally. And flowers weren't just luxury crops. They were obligations. Lean closer now and notice how the flower chinampa is different. The rows are narrower, the soil lighter. Drainage ditches are shallower. Everything's tuned for aesthetics, not yield. And the farmers? They're moving like stagehands prepping for opening night. One is trimming petals with a sharp obsidian blade, turning each marigold into a perfect golden disc. Another is checking soil pH with crushed leaves, tasting the edge of acidity the way a sommelier might swish wine. These people are serious. And they have to be. Because the flower tax is real. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Certain Aztec neighborhoods were taxed not in maize, cocoa beans, or cloth, but in flowers. Entire districts were designated as floral tribute zones. Their job was to produce absurd quantities of specific blooms on fixed schedules, with quotas so strict that missing them could mean punishment. What kind of punishment? Well, if you were lucky, just a formal scolding by your Kalpuli leader and a reduced water allotment. If you were less lucky, your plot might be reassigned, or worse, temple officials might decide your family needs to spend a week cleaning ritual knives. Not everyone was built for pressure farming. Historians still argue whether the flower quotas were a clever way of balancing crop rotation or simply a decorative flex by the elite. Did the priests genuinely need that many garlands, or were they just aesthetically needy? Were flowers truly sacred, or just the ancient version of luxury branding? Either way, the result was the same. Chinampa farmers were expected to deliver. And not just any flower-specific breeds, colors, and blooming times. Miss a blooming window, and you might ruin a temple festival. Nobody wants to be the guy who messed up the Feast of Tolok because his dahlias bloomed early, but it wasn't all gloom and doom. Flower farmers held serious clout. Their skills were respected, their products revered. During public ceremonies, floral artisans were often seated near nobility, recognized for their contributions. And in battle processions, warriors returned to the city not only with prisoners and weapons, but often crowned in garland symbols of divine approval and earthly admiration. A warrior with a bouquet? That wasn't weakness. That was high status. The connection between flowers and death was especially strong. Cempasúchil, the orange marigold, was believed to guide spirits. When laid in rows on altars or floated down canals, they created a fragrant bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead. And since the Aztec spiritual universe was practically overbooked with gods needing regular tribute, the demand for flowers never stopped. You're beginning to see how exhausting it must have been. Farming in a world where missing a bloom cycle could lead to divine wrath. Where your azaleas weren't just for market, they were for the moon goddess. And she did not like wilting. One flower farmer you pass waves lazily as he adjusts a shade net over his latest seedlings. He's growing Xochitl Citlali, star. Flowers, a rare purple bloom that's rumored to attract hummingbirds and was once used in love spells. Whether or not the spells worked, you can't say. But the flower itself is stunning, a burst of violet that seems almost bioluminescent. In the morning sun, he tells you in a low voice that nobles sometimes request them for weddings, and that occasionally, those same nobles try to seduce the farmers into revealing their growing secrets. He laughs, he won't tell, you believe him. There's a quiet pride here, a recognition that flower farming is more than decoration, it's prestige. A well-kept flower chinampa is like a calling card, a sign that you're not just surviving. You're flourishing, literally. And it's not just for ceremonies. Some flowers were medicinal, others were culinary. A few were even turned into dyes or used in body paint. You catch a whiff of something sharp and sweet, probably placecalytl, the tooth flower used in mouth rinses and breath fresheners. So yes, even dental hygiene had a botanical solution. Nothing was wasted in the chinampa system. If it could be grown, it could be used. And if it could be used, it could be taxed. Welcome to Empire. You start noticing the delicate balance again. Flower chinampas can't be over-fertilized or the blooms burn. They can't be underwatered or the petals wilt. Shade matters. Wind matters. Even bird traffic matters. Too many finches and your cosmos vanish overnight. And there are no scarecrows here. Only vigilance and the occasional sharp whistle. It's farming as performance art. Precision masquerading as whimsy. You lean back. The canoe gently nudging a floating mat of discarded petals. The water around you is speckled with color, yesterday's blossoms, now drifting into memory. They don't sink. Not right away. They float a while, turning the canal into a slow-moving rainbow. And you wonder how many offerings were made here. How many flower crowns dissolved into this water. How many chinampa stood waist-deep in the muck, coaxing beauty from compost, knowing full well that every bloom was just another deadline for the divine. The closer you drift toward the city center, the more the vibe shifts. Gone are the solitary farmers tending their muddy gardens in silence. Now you're in canoe traffic. Not bumper to bumper, but bow to bow. Canoes jostle and zigzag. Down narrow water lanes, piled high with squash, herbs, fish, and yes, still more flowers. Children paddle with alarming confidence while elderly women bark instructions from the middle of overloaded skiffs like generalissimos of floating vegetable armies. But you're not here for the market. Not yet. You're here for something rarer and arguably more terrifying. Bureaucracy on water. Imagine the DMV, but everyone's barefoot, sunburnt, and armed with a paddle. Welcome to the world of Aztec agricultural inspectors, the floating bureaucrats of Tenochtitlan. You spot one now, standing tall in his slim canoe, marked by the obsidian insignia strapped to his sash. His paddle strokes are steady, more ceremonial than practical. He's not here to haul produce, he's here to evaluate. And probably to ruin someone's morning. Chinampa audits were real, and these guys took their jobs seriously. They weren't priests or nobles, they were functionaries, trained to inspect soil quality, drainage efficiency, and crop health. Each Kalpuli, the neighborhood collectives, managing land and labor, was assigned inspectors who reported directly to city officials. These weren't bribe-collecting stooges. Well, not always. Their reports influenced tribute demands, land rights, and even access to canal water during the dry season. You mess up your chinampa maintenance, and the next audit could leave you downgraded to ornamental bean duty. One canoe ahead, a farmer spots the inspector and visibly stiffens. He adjusts the bundles on his deck, hastily hides a weedy clump of mildewed amaranth under a cloak. The inspector doesn't flinch. He sidles closer, mutters a few questions, and leans over to inspect the farmer's mud a full hand in, wrist deep, swirling it thoughtfully like it's a fine wine instead of swamp goop. He nods once, moves on. The farmer exhales like he's just dodged a jaguar. You get the sense that chinampa inspections aren't just about compliance. They're about control. In an empire where every kernel of maize supports a soldier or a priest, the state takes agriculture very, very seriously. Here's your quirky fact for this ride-along. Some inspectors were trained using miniature chinampas in temple schools. Like dioramas but with real mud. Students would practice recognizing soil textures, estimating yield from crop patterns, and identifying canal algae that indicated poor dredging. Once trained, they were assigned routes, some as large as entire lake districts. They'd spend days paddling from plot to plot, often accompanied by young apprentices who took notes and learned how to make judgment calls about things like pest damage versus neglect. One apprentice allegedly lost his job after approving a chinampa that later turned out to be overrun with frogs. Frogs, it turns out, weren't just mascots. In large numbers, they damaged roots and over-aerated soil. Too many frogs equals failing. Grade. Tough crowd. Historians still argue whether the inspection system served primarily to improve crop quality or to reinforce elite control over peasant labor. Was this agricultural quality assurance or surveillance? There's compelling evidence for both. But from the farmer's perspective, these visits were a stressful rite of passage. You could prepare all season, rotate crops perfectly, dredge your canal until your arms ached, and still get marked down for something like inconsistent root pruning or an aphid infestation. And if you got flagged, expect a visit from the Kalpuli Council and maybe a demand to assist your neighbor in their plot for a moon cycle as remedial labor. Humbling, if nothing else. The inspector next to you adjusts his stance, reaches into a gourd flask, and sips, probably pulque. Lightly fermented maguey sap, technically only for elders in ritual use, but let's not kid ourselves. Floating all day in the sun with a clipboard and no snacks? You'd sip too. He glances your way, doesn't speak, just nods like he knows you're watching, and maybe he does. Maybe these inspectors are less about enforcement and more about memory living. Archives of agricultural practice, moving from farm to farm, carrying generational knowledge. If you ask an old farmer about soil depth, he'll point to the water. If you ask the inspector, he'll tell you exactly how many finger widths of dredged muck are optimal for late-season squash. You pass more chinampas under inspection. Some get cursory glances. Those belong to high-yield farmers with reputations that precede them. Others get thorough examinations. One plot has a dispute underway, two farmers arguing over who was supposed to dredge the shared canal last week. The inspector steps in, raises a palm, and they fall silent. He scans the water, points to a floating line of debris, and says something curt. The verdict? Both are guilty. Equal penalty. They nod and paddle in opposite directions, muttering curses that include at least one reference to a cursed frog. You try not to smile. These bureaucratic rituals may seem heavy-handed, but they're vital. In a city this dependent on local food production, one bad season could spiral into shortages, price hikes, or worse, political unrest. Chinampas weren't just private property. They were part of the state's strategic infrastructure. That's why canal routes were mapped and recorded, chinampa outputs tallied, and tribute deliveries tracked down to the last bean. And those flower farmers from earlier? They got inspected too, sometimes even more aggressively. After all, you can't let a temple ceremony go under-decorated just because someone overwatered their dahlias. You drift past the inspector now, and he raises a hand, more signal than greeting. Maybe he's letting you pass because he sees no tools in your canoe. Maybe he's just bored. Or maybe he knows this plot is part of a high-trust loop, one of those areas where farmers have earned enough reputation that oversight is more symbolic than functional. There's a rhythm to governance here too. Too much control, and the farmers revolt. Too little, and the lake turns to chaos. Somewhere between those extremes floats this man with his flask and his inscrutable gaze, keeping the system just taut. Enough to function. You round the final bend and see the market in the distance, its colors already flaring bright in the morning sun. But before you arrive, your guide slows the canoe and gestures toward a stone platform jutting into the water. This, he tells you quietly, is where inspections began each season. A kind of bureaucratic holy site. It's marked not by shrines, but by a giant obsidian disc carved with rows of crop symbols: maize, beans, chilies, flowers. You realize with a chill that it's a calendar, not of time but of obligation. A year not measured in days, but in harvests. You finally reach the market, just as the city exhales into its morning hustle, and immediately you're engulfed by motion. Canoes dock tightly side by side like clamshells, and the water vibrates with the slosh of oars, the shuffle of bare feet. and the sharp calls of traders announcing their goods in rhythmic nahuatl. The sun is barely above the horizon, but Tlatelolco, the city's great marketplace, is already a living organism. And you, adrift in a sea of floating goods, are about to experience just how sleepless this sleepless city truly is. The smell hits first. A heady cocktail of roasted maize, bruised herbs, dried fish, chili smoke, and something faintly sweet, maybe cacao. The air pulses with scent. A canoe drifts past you stacked to the gunwales with pumpkins, the size of toddlers, followed by another. One carting giant bundles of reeds, probably for new canal barriers or thatching rooftops. Then come the flower canoes. Of course, you recognize those colors now, marigolds and dahlias bobbing softly as their owners, stoic and sleep-deprived, steer them toward their ritual clients. No one's yelling, no one's late. This chaos is planned. But as your canoe docks near the trade platform, what grabs your attention isn't the produce. It's the people. Hundreds, maybe thousands of traders, each belonging to a guild or cow pulley group, each with their own designated spot. Their tunics are marked with color-coded glyphs for squash, maize, beans, salt, chilies. They organize by product type, not family. You watch as a man with skin like tree bark arranges dried chilies into perfect pyramids, next to a young girl stacking baskets of tiny, twitching shrimp. A fisherman next door yawns so wide he almost drops his net, then begins unrolling what might be the smallest and possibly smelliest crab you've ever seen. And here's the thing, none of these people slept in. No one in Tenochtitlan truly does. The farmers? Up before the sun to tend their chinampas. The traders? Up earlier to collect, sort, prep, and paddle. The priests? Chanting before light breaks. The soldiers? Already halfway through drills. Even the duck seems slightly caffeinated. This is a city that breathes in labor and exhales ritual, and it does so before most people would bother hitting snooze. You think back to your own morning routine, something involving coffee, groaning, and regret, and realize it wouldn't fly here. Not even close. Your guide waves you toward a stall where cooked tamales are being unwrapped in steaming bundles. You accept one, a soft pillow of maize filled with beans and squash flour, spicy enough to jolt your brain awake. The vendor smiles, then leans in to ask what chinampa you farm. When you admit you're just a visitor, her expression shifts. Not unkindly, just differently. Chinampa farmers are city builders, dreamers in mud. If you're not one of them, you're something else entirely. She still takes your thanks, but now you see the divide. In a place this interdependent, people identify by function, not origin. Who you are is what you do. Quirky fact time, in certain sections of the market, traders weren't allowed to speak. Silent barter zones. That's right, no talking. Instead, goods were laid out, and buyers placed their offers, often in cacao beans, cotton cloth, or small jade pieces. If the seller liked it, they took it. If not, they silently shook their head and waited for a better offer. This system kept arguments down and created a surprisingly peaceful, almost meditative corner of the otherwise bustling bazaar. Imagine silent auction crossed with produce stand, except your tomatoes might cost you a tiny stone figurine or half a spool of thread. Historians still argue whether these markets were more capitalist or more communitarian. Prices fluctuated, supply and demand mattered. But the state also regulated essential goods and ensured surplus crops were rerouted to temples or redistributed during shortages. Some see this as an early proto-market economy. Others say it was closer to managed socialism with a spiritual twist. Either way, it worked. This market fed a city of hundreds of thousands, without horses, without wheels, without currency as we'd recognize it. All powered by canoes, conversation, and chinas. You wander deeper into the stalls, pausing to admire a canoe stacked with obsidian tools. Farming blades, fishing hooks, even the dreaded inspection knives used by bureaucrats. They gleam under the morning light like shark teeth. One merchant offers you a miniature hoe, palm-sized and delicately etched. A souvenir. You almost take it, then remember you have nowhere to keep it and zero practical use for obsidian, unless planning to open a very niche Etsy store. The sounds change as you move. At the center of the market is the administrative plaza, a raised stone platform where trade officials oversee deals, resolve disputes, and occasionally announce new quotas. You hear a crier now, reading a new decree about canal cleaning rotations. The farmers around you groan. Apparently, a section near the temple district has gone neglected, and all adjacent chinampa crews are being rotated in to fix it, voluntarily. Which in Empire speak means mandatory. Then there's a sudden silence, a hush that sweeps over the plaza like a cool breeze. A high priest arrives not in a canoe, but by foot, flanked by 2 warriors and carrying a flower garland. He's here to collect the day's ritual offerings. He moves from stall to stall, collecting specific items: maize from here, flowers from there, a bundle of red chilies, a gourd of pulque. These aren't payments, they're promises. The city takes, but it also gives. Ritual keeps the balance. You watch as the priest lifts the garland, whispers a prayer, and lays it in a canoe bound for the great temple district. Everyone bows slightly. Then the noise returns, as though the silence never happened. As the day warms, you begin to feel the sleeplessness of the soil in your bones, the pace of it, the way every aspect of city life cycles through the chinampa system. The tamale you ate grew in that mud. The flowers you saw floated here from reed-lined plots. Even the canoe beneath you, its frame shaped by trees grown along canal borders, reinforced by laborers who wake earlier than the sun dares to rise. You start to understand why rest here isn't stillness, it's rotation. One farmer sleeps while the other dredges. One plot rests while the other blooms. The city never stops, but it does shift. Like the water, it rides on. You glance back at the marketplace as your canoe pushes off. The sun is higher now, and so is the noise. Bargaining, laughter, the splash of someone falling in. Probably a novice. Trader who forgot to tie off their skiff. In the chaos, everything still moves with purpose. You don't hear gears grinding. You hear paddles dipping. You see canoes gliding. This isn't industry, it's fluidity. Not a sleepless grind, but a dance, an empire in motion. The canoe glides away from the market's echo and slips back into the southern waterways where the city's tempo changes. Here, amid a web of narrower canals, things grow quiet, not in laziness, but in focus. You're entering the chinampa zones that double as military staging grounds. Not officially, of course. No signs, no drums. Just strategic proximity and a subtle change in atmosphere. You notice it first in the way the canals widen in places, like the city's circulatory system flexing for speed. Then you spot canoes that aren't laden with squash or flowers, but with bundles of wood, nets, baskets with tarps covering shapes too symmetrical to be fish. This isn't a produce run. It's preparation. Most people picture Aztec warfare as dry ground battles, warriors in jaguar pelts, obsidian clubs swinging under banners of flayed gods. But out here in the watery veins of Tenochtitlan, war moved on water. Chinampas weren't just farmland. They were fortresses, ambush points, supply lines, and hideouts. In the hands of a clever commander, a chinampa network became a maze deadly to invaders and a tactical dream for locals who knew every current and cul-de-sac. Here's the setup. During peacetime, farmers would reinforce their plots not just for flood resistance, but for potential defense. Willow barriers were allowed to grow thick and tangled, forming natural walls. Some chinampas were deliberately shaped with curved ends and sunken reed pockets, perfect for hiding small canoes. These weren't accidents. This was battlefield landscaping. If an enemy entered the canal system, they'd quickly find themselves in a labyrinth of dead ends, low visibility, and narrow turns. Aztec warriors could ambush from behind flower hedges, leap from canoe to plot, and disappear again before anyone could scream duck. Or in Nahuatl, Quetzalli. Quirky fact break: chinampa districts often had built-in emergency signals. Farmers stationed at key points would beat drums or blow into conch shells when invaders or scouts were spotted. The sound would ripple across the water, 3 notes for spotted enemy canoes, 5 for foot patrols. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Entire militia units could be mobilized in minutes, slipping silently into reed tunnels with weapons stashed under their harvest baskets. And these weren't just volunteer militias. Many chinampa farmers doubled as trained warriors. Military training was mandatory for males in most classes, and farmers were no exception. During campaigns, they'd be called to fight. During peace, they trained locally, often using the canals themselves for drills. You think push-ups are hard? Try doing them on a canoe. Or chasing a partner through a floating obstacle course while carrying a wooden club. The water became a gym. The chinampa a training mat with roots. Historians still argue how much of the canal system was designed with military use in mind versus civilian utility. Some suggest the defense features were secondary adaptations. Others argue that military planning was embedded from the beginning. Given the Aztecs' obsession with dual-purpose infrastructure, it's likely both. A good chinampa could grow corn and hide a platoon. You spot a group ahead, now 6. Young men hauling what looks like long poles across a chinampa and dropping them silently into the water. A drill, you assume, until one of them motions to the edge and you see it. A trap. A lattice of underwater stakes designed to snag enemy canoes. It wouldn't sink them outright, but it'd tip the boat just enough to send invaders tumbling. In a normal garden, that'd be sabotage. Here, it's strategy. These men aren't farmers today. They're guardians. And this garden is there. Weapon. Your guide tells you, almost too casually, that during the city's last great defense against rival city-states, entire chinampa sectors were flooded on purpose. Barriers were cut. Canals were overfilled. The rising water didn't just damage plots, it turned farmland into marsh again, impassable to outsiders. Meanwhile, locals in raised canoes could navigate it with ease. Guerrilla gardening, you think? But sharper. Even the crops got militarized. Maize was stockpiled not just for food, but for creating hard, dry flour that could be transported to the front. Amaranth seeds packed with protein were mixed with honey to form dense energy balls, perfect for marching warriors. One temple allegedly demanded a yearly tribute of chinampa-grown squash, specifically for the army's medicinal stew, used to treat battle wounds and stomach issues. War is glamorous until the beans hit wrong. You pass by a seemingly peaceful plot where chilies grow in thick clusters, and your guide mentions that in a pinch, chili powder was thrown at enemies. Not a myth. Ground chili dust could be weaponized, blown into enemy faces to disorient or delay. It was spicy chemical warfare, pre-industrial style. Picture trying to fight with your eyes watering and your lungs screaming for relief. Effective? Absolutely. Ethical? Debatable. But then again, everything in Tenochtitlan walked the razor's edge between sacred and savage. And the warriors themselves? Many were also chinamperos. The empire wasn't class blind, but it respected effectiveness. A farmer who could maintain his plot, produce excess tribute, and fight valiantly might rise in the ranks. Some warrior lodges even sponsored chinampa plots for training purposes. Young recruits would be sent to tend them as a test of discipline and patience. If you could manage a stubborn squash crop through a rainy season and a canal collapse, you probably had the grit to survive battle. The connection between land and war runs deep here. Chinampas weren't isolated. They fed the city, but they also protected it. They trained its defenders. They provided hiding places, staging zones, retreat paths. You start to see them less as farms and more as living forts, camouflaged, beautiful, deadly when they had to be. And unlike stone walls or iron gates, these defenses grew back. Burn a chinampa and it could be rebuilt. Flood it and it could regrow. The lake was their weakness and their strength. And these farmers, with mud on their knees and obsidian in their belts, knew how to turn it into a moat and a minefield in the same breath. As the sun climbs higher and the shadows shrink, you pass one final training group, teenagers sparring with wooden clubs atop a low chinampa platform. They're laughing even as they knock each other into the water, a rite of passage. A childhood shaped by canals, crops, and combat. You see it now, how the empire didn't separate war from work, how the sleepless soil also grew soldiers, and how, on these floating plots of mud and memory, peace was always temporary. But the garden never stopped growing. The sun is now high enough to bounce off the water like a sarcastic mirror, and your guide has started squinting every few minutes while paddling through what feels like rush hour, but make it liquid. You're in the middle of canal congestion, the ancient equivalent of gridlock, except no one's honking and everyone's wielding paddles instead of car horns. This is the Tenochtitlan midday market wave, and it's gloriously chaotic. Canoes loaded with everything from maize bundles to feather fans squeeze past each other in tight, choreographed wiggles. At one point, 2 boats get stuck trying to pass through a narrow canal, and their drivers launch into a soft-spoken, but clearly furious argument, conducted entirely through passive-aggressive paddling. Welcome to ancient aquatic road rage. Can't help but notice the sheer variety of goods moving across the water. One canoe teeters under the weight of salt bricks. Another smells strongly of dried fish and regret. Behind you, a vendor balances cages of live birds, probably turkeys or the occasional xochitl quail, prized for both song and soup. The canals have become highways, arteries of commerce where etiquette is fluid and space is a suggestion. There are no lanes, no signs, no traffic lights, just centuries of waterborne instinct. Children paddle solo. Dogs nap in the bows of family boats. One ambitious woman is painting glyphs onto gourds as she steers with her foot. It's impressive, little terrifying, and very Tenochtitlan. And here's your quirky fact for the ride. The Aztecs had traffic laws. That's right. Certain canals were designated as one-way routes during high traffic times. Market days meant strict enforcement. There were signs, stone glyph markers along the canal edges that indicated paddle direction, cargo restrictions, and even docking permissions. You couldn't just park your canoe anywhere. Violating these rules could earn you a fine, a confiscated load, or the worst punishment of all, being assigned to dredging duty in the trash canals for a week. No one wanted to clean the canal behind the fish vendors. That smell did not forgive some. Canals had toll point strategic chokeholds where officials recorded goods and sometimes collected tribute or tax in kind. If you were moving 10 sacks of beans, you might be required to surrender one as civic payment. And if you thought you could sneak past, well, let's just say that toll enforcers had their own canoes, and they weren't afraid to chase you down. Paddle piracy was not tolerated. Historians still debate how centralized this water traffic system was. Some argue it was tightly controlled by the temple authorities and market guilds, while others suggest a more organic network built on community, consensus, and enforcement. Whatever the case, it worked. Goods flowed efficiently, and while the occasional boat tangle or bean spill happened, the system sustained an empire, all without wheels, without roads, without beasts of burden, just wood, water, and coordination. As you float deeper into this living freeway, you begin to see the rituals behind the movement. Every merchant has a routine. Some chant softly as they paddle, keeping time with the current. Others pause at canal shrines, small alcoves in the walls with offerings of flowers, feathers, or the occasional ceramic cup filled with water, and what smells suspiciously like pulque. These are tributes to Xalquilutlic, the goddess of water and canals. She's the unseen force that makes this whole liquid system glide instead of grind. Offerings are her toldot, and there's humor too. Floating jokes. One canoe sports a crude reed sculpture shaped like a monkey, holding a chili pepper in its teeth. Another has a hand-painted slogan in Nahuatl that translates roughly to, "My other canoe is a jaguar." The drivers grin as they pass, teasing each other in local slang. You catch the rhythm of their banter, and for a moment, the whole system feels less like infrastructure and more like family. No one is truly a stranger on the water. You've all bumped into the same reeds, cursed the same bottlenecks, prayed the same storm would hold off until after you reach the docks. You pass under a low bridge, really more of a wooden arch built, to connect two large chinampas, and for a second, everything dims. The light softens, the sound hushes. You see ancient graffiti etched into the beams. Names, dates, jokes. A centuries-old scratch reads, "Xochitl was here, 6 rabbit." Another declares, "Best maize north of the Temple District." You smile. Apparently, advertising has always been a thing. Then, as you emerge on the other side, the sunlight crashes back in and the noise resumes, louder than before. Your guide turns left into what he calls the merchant fast lane, a slightly wider canal with smooth currents and fewer children, dangling their feet over the sides. Here, the pace quickens. Canoes are longer, sleeker. These are professional haulers, traders moving bulk goods between districts. They know every current, every shortcut. One zips past you so fast it leaves. Awake. You glance at the driver, a wiry man with arms like bundled rope, who nods as he flies by, then disappears into a side channel like a fish with somewhere to be dot. It's worth noting that not everyone paddled themselves. Some merchants hired canal runners, professional paddlers who ferried goods in shifts. These guys were the Uber drivers of the lake, minus the app and plus a whole lot of arm strength. Some were even unionized, belonging to canoe guilds that set fair rates and organized labor strikes when temple officials tried to underpay for festival deliveries. That's right, the Aztecs had organized labor. Never underestimate people who paddle before dawn. Then there were the elite canoes. You don't see many, but your guide gestures as one approaches a long, narrow vessel painted in rich reds and golds, lined with fine mats and bearing a canopy of woven reed. Inside, a noble reclines while 2 servants paddle in unison. You catch a glimpse of jewelry, feathers, a bored expression, probably headed to the temple or a council meeting. The canoe moves with deliberate grace, and everyone gives way. Not out of fear, but out of ingrained choreography. The water has its own hierarchy. Still, for all its efficiency, the canal network isn't perfect. Accidents happen. Canoes tip. Goods fall. Someone always forgets to secure their pulque jug. You see a young boy frantically bailing out his boat, with a gourd bowl, half laughing, half panicking as his chili peppers float away like spicy rubber duckies. Nearby, 2 older women are trying to untangle their boats, which have become romantically entwined after a collision involving ducks. No one's hurt, no one's mad. Just another day on the lake dot, and as you pass by, you start to realize something deeper. This isn't just traffic, it's time. The canals move like veins, yes, but also like memory. Each route is a story. Each turn, a decision. Each collision, a chapter in the unending tale of a city that rides water like a dancer on silk. The chinampas sleep between harvests. The priests chat at dawn. The traders laugh, argue, paddle. But the water? The water never stops. You ease away from the rush of the canal traffic and slip into a quieter waterway where the air grows thicker, as if holding its breath. The light here is dappled, broken by the leafy fingers of overhanging trees. You hear the faint sound of water slapping gently against canoe hulls. But now there's a different cadence, a murmur not of trade but of ritual. You're approaching the spiritual veins of Tenochtitlan, where chinampas are more than food factories or military bases. Here, the soil is sacred. The crops don't just feed bodies, they feed gods. And the hands that work them know it. You pass a small floating altar tucked along the reeds, just a few stones arranged in a triangle, topped with wilted flowers and what looks like a smear of blood. Not enough to alarm you, just enough to remind you something was given here, probably a bird, maybe a frog, maybe something else. You don't ask. You just watch as the canoe ahead of you slows, and the woman inside bows her head, whispers something into the water, and gently releases a handful of marigold petals. They scatter on the surface and spin slowly with the current, drifting like soft confessions. This isn't rare. Ritual was embedded in everything, especially farming. You see, to the Aztecs, the chinampa wasn't just soil. It was a living body. The lake was the blood, the willows its bones, the maize its breath. To plant was to touch the flesh of the earth goddess, Thaltacutli, who had been torn apart by the gods to create the land. That soil, her skin, that muck dredged from the canals, her innards, nothing was neutral. To farm was to wound and heal her in the same act. And every harvest was a moment of guilt, gratitude, and repetition. Each planting season began with an offering. The farmer would dig into the plot, kneel, and bury a token: feathers, stones, bits of jade, or small animals into the mud. It wasn't superstition, it was protocol. It was acknowledgement. You don't take from the earth without paying rent. And you certainly don't plant maize, the sacred crop, without speaking to Sentiatl, the maize god. Some chinamperos even whispered to their seeds before burying them, naming each one like a tiny prayer. Quirky fact incoming. In some families, it was customary to rub chili paste on the forearms before planting, both to energize the body and to signal the gods that the work was beginning. Others smeared a dab on their eyelids, not pleasant, but meant to open the inner eye to see if the soil was ready. Whether this actually worked or just resulted in farmers blinking in agony, all morning we may never know. But rituals were personal, family-held, and often fiercely guarded. You didn't just farm, you performed. You participated, and it wasn't just the planting. Harvesting had its own rites. First ears of maize weren't eaten. They were placed on household altars. Beans were sorted with care to avoid including any with death marks, dark spots that hinted at divine rejection. Squash was burned at the edges of the plot as an offering to Zilanin, the goddess of young corn. If your harvest was good, you gave thanks. If it was bad, you asked forgiveness. Sometimes with flowers, sometimes with blood. A scratch on the forearm, a drop onto the soil. No one bled dramatically. This wasn't about gore. It was about acknowledgement. Historians still argue whether these rituals were mandated by priestly orders or evolved from grassroots belief. Did the state impose these practices as agricultural control, or did they arise naturally from a population that saw the world as profoundly alive? The truth probably lies in the middle. But for the chinamperos themselves, it didn't matter. You didn't farm without honoring the unseen. That would be like building a house without a foundation, or worse, insulting the house while doing it. You float past a cluster of chinampas that look different, wilder, almost neglected. But then, you notice the carefully planted circles of herbs, the paths formed from woven reed mats, the smoke rising from a hidden hearth. These aren't food plots. These are ritual gardens, managed by priest farmers, midwives, and herbalists. Here grow plants you don't eat: white sage, bloodroot, sacred tobacco, and something sharp-scented your guide won't name. These herbs aren't for cooking. They're for ceremony, for medicine, for communicating with gods, and they are grown with precision. The smoke curling into the sky is from a resin fire. Copal, likely. Used to cleanse the air, call spirits, and confuse. Mosquitoes. 2 out of 3 isn't bad. The boat slows again as your guide points to a narrow canal lined with bright red blooms. He tells you this is where warriors come the morning before a campaign. Not to bathe, to receive a blessing. The red flowers tlacoxquetl, or blood flowers, are crushed and mixed with water, then poured over the warriors' heads. Not to protect them, but to prepare them for the idea of death. A reminder that the earth they walk on, the soil they fight for, was built on sacrifice. Not metaphorically, literally. Remember, Tenochtitlan was founded on an island where an eagle devoured a snake. Every story here begins in blood and becomes beauty. Your guide laughs softly and tells you about a local legend, a chinampa who grew maize so sweet. It was said the goddess herself visited his plot at night to bless the soil. Neighbors became jealous. One tried to curse the plot with poisoned water. The next harvest, the jealous farmer's plot flooded, while the blessed one sprouted double yields. The moral of the story? Never mess with another man's maize. You nod solemnly. A lesson for the ages. As the sun begins to lean westward, shadows stretch long across the plots. You pass by a final altar, this one larger, with rows of candles, and a faded skull resting in the reeds. Human? Maybe, maybe not. Your guide doesn't say. Some questions are best left on the water. But you do see the offerings, chilies, squash, a necklace of feathers, and a small obsidian blade. It gleams faintly. The soil here is darker than elsewhere, richer. You feel something tighten in your chest. Not fear, just awe. Because now you see it. These chinampas are not just clever bits of engineering. They are the interface between world's life and death, nature and culture, water and land. And the people who work them don't sleep because the gods don't sleep. Not really. They watch, they listen, they wait for the next offering, the next planting, the next whispered promise into the soil. You shift slightly in your seat as the canoe rocks from a sudden gust, warm and wet like breath from a giant mouth. Overhead, storm clouds are starting to gather, slowly at first, but with the passive-aggressive certainty of someone arriving early to ruin a party. Your guide tilts his head toward the sky, squints, and mutters something about the rains. You've been gliding across the chinampas for days now, basking in their improbable beauty, but you're about to learn the one truth that binds all farmers across all eras. Nature, no matter how cleverly managed, still has the last laugh. Because when it rains in Tenochtitlan, it doesn't gently kiss the soil. It shows up like an unpaid debt collector. Fast, loud, unrelenting. These chinampas were engineered for water, yes, but not too much water. And therein lies the catch. The lake giveth, and the lake taketh. During the dry season, canal levels can drop just enough to stall canoes or expose roots to sunburn. But during the rainy season, oh, it's chinampa roulette. Some plots flood entirely. Others slump at the corners from softening foundations. Entire reed walls collapse. The floating gardens do not actually float, but their buoyant myths do very little when the water decides to rise faster than expected and pushes through the willow hedges like a particularly rude guest. You pass a chinampa in the middle of repair, 2 men hauling a fresh batch of teeptate. That sediment-rich muck and layering it desperately over one corner that's clearly started to sink. The angle is subtle but visible, the way a table leg buckles when it loses a nail. They're trying to firm up the foundation, using packed reeds and bundled roots like a bandage over a bruise. But they're racing the weather. Overhead, thunder rolls distant for now, but growing. This isn't a rare emergency. It's seasonal. Every year, the rains test the limits of this floating system. And every year, the farmers push back. Chinampa resilience isn't just about engineering. It's about endurance. You have to anticipate floods, reinforce weak spots, Rotate crops to absorb excess water, and always watch the edges. That's where the danger begins. If your plot's edge collapses, even by a few feet, the integrity of the whole structure shifts, like pulling a single card from the bottom of a very muddy house of cards. Quirky tidbit: some chinampa farmers used fish bladder sacks, yes, actual inflatables, to measure pressure at certain underwater spots. They'd tie them beneath suspect sections of a plot and return later to see how compressed they'd become. It wasn't exact science, but it told them where the weight of the soil was starting to cause trouble. Sort of a primitive waterbed pressure sensor, except instead of sleep quality, they were measuring sink risk. Historians still debate whether these flood cycles were fully predictable or wildly inconsistent. Some argue the Aztecs developed long-term water level charts, possibly carved into stone tablets or recorded in pictographs, helping to time planting and dredging. Others believe the lake behaved like a moody god, sometimes generous, sometimes reckless. Either way, everyone learned to adapt. And if they didn't, well, those plots didn't last. You pass another chinampa, this one abandoned. It's eerie. Once ordered rows of crops are now a tangled mess of vines and rot. The canal edge has collapsed inwards, no willow hedges, just a sad float of moss and broken reed mats. Your guide says nothing, but you can tell this used to be someone's pride. Now it's a cautionary tale. Abandoned chinampas like this are sometimes called sleeping gardens. They can be revived, but only with enormous labor and luck. You have to drain the plot, dredge it back to shape, replant structural trees, and hope the lake forgives you. Not everyone has the stamina for it, or the time, and yet some do. You see a crew ahead reclaiming a sunken plot. They're using a pulley system strung between canoes to haul massive reed mats into place, trying to rebuild the walls before the real rains arrive. One woman stands knee-deep in muck, arms coated to the elbow, calmly instructing a younger boy as he anchors a pole into the softened lake bed. Their movements are quiet, practiced, no one panics. You start to understand, these aren't catastrophes. They're chores. Wet, messy, high-stakes chores, but still part of the seasonal rhythm. Meanwhile, above you, the clouds get moodier. The sky now looks like it's wearing an old bruise. Lightning flickers not dangerously close, but enough to make the ducks nervous. And the ducks are always the first to complain. You see them moving inland, toward higher plots, quacking in a chorus that sounds suspiciously like a warning. Ask your guide what happens if the rains overwhelm everything. He shrugs. Sometimes they do. Entire districts can flood. Temple stores are emptied. Emergency teams paddle out to rescue stranded families or salvage crops. There's a network of flood protocols, canal diversions, even floating platforms where goods are stored during peak downpours. But it's never perfect. There's always loss. Always someone who didn't quite finish reinforcing their reed mat in time. Someone whose chili patch becomes a swamp. But here's the beautiful part. Once the flood recedes, the lake leaves behind gifts to new sediment, dead algae, fish remains, even bird droppings. It's messy, but it's fertile. Chinampas rebuilt. After a flood often produce better crops the following year. So in a way, collapse is part of the growth cycle. Nature doesn't just punish. It resets. You pass under a wooden footbridge now, and there's a group of kids dangling their feet, cheering each time lightning flashes in the distance. A few adults scold them half-heartedly while covering produce under tarps. You feel a drop of rain on your forehead, then another. The surface of the canal dimpled. A gentle tap, tap, tap. It's starting. Your guide doesn't rush. He paddles steadily toward a shelter built between two large chinampas, a canopy of woven mats and dried reeds stretched between tree trunks, just high enough to duck under. Inside, other farmers are already gathered. Some are sharing dried maize cakes. Others are patching holes in their canoes. No one complains. This is what happens. The rains come, the plots get wet. The lake threatens to reclaim what was taken from it. And the chinamperos, sleepless as ever, wait it out, eyes on the clouds. Minds already calculating how much mud they'll need to dredge tomorrow. Because here, in this world of floating gardens and gods with muddy hands, even the storm is just another farmer shaking the soil. Loose so something new can grow. The rain comes hard for a while, hammering the canopy above like 1,000 tiny drums, then fades to a whisper and finally vanishes altogether, as if it never happened. The sky clears in that sudden smug way that tropical storms often do, as if daring you to mention the mess they left behind. You emerge from the shelter, stepping carefully into the canoe, which now has a shallow pool at the bottom, occupied by a single confused frog. Your guide scoops it out without ceremony and flicks it gently into the canal. Business resumes. The chinampas glisten under the pale sunlight, water pooling on tarps, dripping from squash leaves, sliding off the pointed ends of maize stalks. But even as things dry, you notice something strange, a plot ahead that seems excessive. Too green, too tall, too ornamental. You drift closer and realize this isn't food farming. This is floral opulence dialed up to 11, where most chinampas balance function and beauty. This one is unapologetically gorgeous. Meticulously arranged. Rows of rare flowers cascade in waves of red, yellow, and purple. The edges are manicured. There's a low fence of braided reeds. And near the center stands a pergola-like structure covered in vines and hung with clay bells that tinkle in the breeze. This is a luxury chinampa. And it's not feeding families, it's feeding egos. Your guide mutters something unflattering. Under his breath, "Noble land," he says. "Flower lords." You realize what he means. Some of these chinampas aren't just agricultural marvels, they're status symbols. Owned by high-ranking nobles, merchant elites, or temple authorities, these floral showpieces were meant less for growing and more for showing. Displays of wealth, piety, or depending on who you ask, vanity. This isn't new. The shift toward ornamental flower farming started slowly, centuries ago, but has snowballed into something that now quietly destabilizes the entire system. Here's the thing. Chinampas are incredibly efficient at growing staple crops. That's what they were built for. But flowers, especially the fancy ones, require different care, lighter soils, more shade, higher maintenance. And while maize feeds a family, a dahlia feeds a ritual or a party, which means less food, more pressure, and increasingly unequal land distribution. What began as tribute farming has become a horticultural arms race. Quirky fact time. Some noble families reportedly bribed inspectors to rezone food chinampas into flower zones, citing temple requirements or ritual necessity. In practice, it meant more chinampas producing garlands for feasts and fewer producing beans for stew. Over time, these ornamental plots became prestige assets, bought, sold, inherited, and even fought over. It's said that one minor noble poisoned his neighbor's canal just to destroy a particularly enviable crop of rare blue xochitl. The flower industry was blooming, literally, but not without consequences. You see it on the faces of the nearby farmers. Their plots are sturdy, but plain: beans, maize, amaranth. Functional, hungry crops. But now they're flanked by chinampas that serve as backyard galleries for the elite, and the pressure to keep up both economically and aesthetically is rising. One farmer tells your guide quietly that last season, his neighbor converted half his plot to roses, hoping to win favor with a temple priest. It worked. He got a tax break. The beans he used to grow, replaced with empty praise and an ornamental water feature shaped like a serpent. Historians still argue whether this shift toward floriculture was inevitable or manipulated. Did the empire push for more flowers to meet spiritual demands, or did Elites co-opt the system to create visual power statements. Either way, the result is the same: less food security, more land inequality. And while the market glows with petals, more commoners are relying on trade, not homegrown staples. The chinampa economy, once a model of sustainable autonomy, is becoming ornamental, hollow. You float past another luxurious plot now, and it's even more surreal. There's a platform built for poetry recitals, cushions arranged on reed mats, musicians in the corner practicing on flutes and drums. This isn't a farm, it's a stage. In the middle of a food network, your guide points at the sky. They plant words now, he says. Hope someone eats. Poetry, to be fair, not all flower chinampas are excess. Many still serve ritual functions, producing sacred marigolds, medicinal blooms, temple offerings. Those are respected. But when the balance tips, when too many plots chase beauty over bread, problems ripple out, prices rise, markets tighten, and the poorest farmers, those without noble friends or poetic ambitions, feel the squeeze first. You round a bend and see a small crowd gathered at a canal's edge. A young farmer stands beside a collapsed plot, waterlogged and sagging. His neighbor, an older man, paces nearby, gesturing angrily at what appears to be runoff from a floral chinampa upstream. Too much water diverted for ornamental irrigation. Not enough control. Now someone's staple crop is underwater. A temple official arrives, listens, nods, and suggests mediation. But you already know how this ends. The floral plot survives. The food plot drowns. The farmer starts over. It's subtle, this decay, not loud, not violent, just a quiet unraveling. As more land shifts toward prestige use, as more inspectors look the other way, as more tribute is paid in petals instead of calories, the old system groans. It hasn't broken yet, but it's bending. And every flower that blooms on stolen space is a reminder that even the most sustainable systems can be corrupted, not by failure, but by success repurposed for vanity. You pass one last plot. Before sunset, half maize, half cosmos, the farmer looks tired. He's trying to hedge his bets, straddle the old world and the new, feed his family, and still court the favor of a noble who requested cosmos for a wedding garland. It's a delicate dance, one that only works until someone slips. As the light fades and the chinampas blur into dark lines against the lake, you realize you're floating through a system that was once flawless, balanced, efficient. Now it's being asked to perform too many roles: feed the city, beautify the rituals, impress the guests, serve the gods, satisfy the egos. And somewhere between the maize and the marigolds, between sustenance and spectacle, the soil is starting to sigh. Dusk settles like damp cloth draped over your shoulders as you paddle toward the western chinampa fringe, the zone where the city literally collides with the Spaniards' strange, land-dwelling world. The air thickens with tension. Not just from the thickening fog drifting off the lake, but from dread that's almost palpable. You sense the story is shifting. The gardens you floated through are about to confront a new kind of threat. Quartz and his crew aren't just here to talk. They bring fire, metal, horses, and a worldview that can't compute floating gardens. You glance at your guide, whose eyes have narrowed. This is where the magic meets misunderstanding. The Spaniards arrive in canoes, weird wooden ones that don't feel quite at home, sliding through maize rows, and some even clank as though they're fighting the water. They look fragile, unnatural, artificial intruders in a living landscape. And they carry weapons that spit fire and snap like angry gods. Imagine standing in your chinampa benchmarked precision, century-fine balance, a system that's endured for generations, and seeing a man aim a crossbow at you. Worse yet, seeing him ride a horse across the reed-lined waterways, trampling maize and beans like a giant stomping party favors. To the Aztecs, the Spanish horses must have looked like invincible demons, untouchable, savage, and utterly incomprehensible. The perfect symbols of otherness. And here they are, about to crash. The floating party, but it's not all war right away. The Spanish are confused. They don't get canals. They trip into them. They misuse maddeningly efficient irrigation with buckets that drain plots. They tell farmers the chinampas are filthy and attempt to drain them with rudimentary ditches because that's how agriculture works in their world. Phrases like, "this land is cursed," are whispered in Spanish and Nahuatl, sometimes both together for emphasis. A conquistador collapses into a canal, sputtering. A farmer helps him up with a smirk behind his mask, otherwise known as ironic hospitality. The Spaniards assume they'll conquer with brute strength. But here, everything fights back. The water, the mud, the maize, quirky fact break. Court's own chronicler, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, reportedly wrote that he could not fathom how fields could float like islands and suggested draining Lake Texcoco to make Tenochtitlan more civilized. It never occurred to him to learn from the system, just to destroy it. Historians still argue whether this strategy shows sheer ignorance or calculated destruction. Either way, it sets the tone for what comes next. Scientists today say the chinampa zones helped regulate pathogens in the lake water. The Spaniards' attempts at draining unleashed less visible killers, cholera-like stuff, dysentery, smallpox-carrying mosquitoes. For the Spaniards, colonization wasn't just about swords and horses. It was bacteria, viruses, and ecological sabotage. They didn't realize they were weaponizing disease and humidity and drainage patterns. Entire chinampa neighborhoods experienced mysterious hunger, rubble in canals, trees rotting overnight, and fish vanishing. The soil tasted different, less alive. Something fundamental had shifted. You're watching this unfold from your canoe. In some plots, farmers stand in stubborn silence, baskets at their feet, waiting. Others have set their gardens on fire, hoping to deny invaders their spoils. These are radical acts of ecological resistance. You strain to hear crying or prayers, but all you hear is the soft slap of paddles and the whisper of burning reed. Smoke curls into the sky. The smell of charred mud and maize mixed with something fiercer, betrayal, maybe, or heartbreak. A local elder steps into your canoe and recites an injunction: protect the gardens. If they die, we die. That's not just agriculture. That's existential truth. The chinampa isn't just economic. It's cultural oxygen. The empire might fall, but the gardens must survive. You feel the weight of that statement echo through the reeds. The Spaniards attempt to erect fortifications on chinampas. They build palisades, dig trenches, and line canals with stones, which collapses the floating structures beneath. This is not strategic. It's an ecological assault. Chinampas are modular. Break one, the system unravels, and unravel it did. Crops drowned, sediment collapsed, canals stagnated. The water turned fetid. Fish vanished. Historians still argue whether the Spanish intentionally targeted chinampa infrastructure or were just ignorant of its fragility. But the result remains the same: a catastrophic failure of agriculture at the heart of an empire. The siege of Tenochtitlan wasn't just military. It was ecological warfare. Few can escape the collapse, but some farmers refuse to give up. They build new chinampas further into the lake, away from the city's chaos. These are exile gardens, floating oases of resilience. They produce maize, beans, flowers, life-defying death. You see families working in silent determination, children learning to dredge, even as war drums pound in the background. Your canoe drifts past one of these exile gardens. It feels quieter here, gentler, even as gunshots echo in the distance. Life quietly pushes up through mud and water. A single ear of maize stands tall amid the reeds, and something stubbornly alive thrums beneath its kernel. As night approaches, The smoke from central Tenochtitlan drifts past your ears. You paddle home in silence. The garden ghosts float behind, their roots still tangled in water, still clinging. The empire may tumble, but the chinampa lives on, marked by resilience. Even in defeat, the floating gardens continue to teach. Don't drain life, you channel it. You don't conquer nature, you collaborate with it. And if one empire falls, another generation builds in its place. Morning breaks reluctantly, spilling gray light across water that no longer ripples with joy, but trudges along with the weight of memory. You're back on the canals, but they feel different now, quieter, not from peace, but from absence. The air smells faintly of rot and ash, the long breath of a system slowly exhaling centuries of resistance. The chinampas still float, technically, but they're bruised. You see patches of bare soil, plots abandoned mid-season, and others barely clinging to structure, edges collapsed, roots exposed, as if the land itself is exhausted. The empire has fallen, but its agricultural skeleton remains bent, aching, and desperately trying not to dissolve completely. The Spanish, now firmly entrenched in what they call New Spain, have no real interest in maintaining the chinampa system, beyond what they can extract from it. They're not farmers, not really. They're landlords now, reclassifying land, issuing encomiendas like raffle tickets, assigning local families to tend plots not for community sustenance, but for colonial quotas. The logic has shifted. The soil isn't sacred anymore, it's taxable. You pass a former temple district, now half converted into a chapel, with chinampas nearby still functioning, but stripped of ritual. Where before offerings would be whispered into the soil, now a colonial overseer barks orders in garbled Spanish know-it-all pidgin. Más maize, menos flores. More maize, fewer flowers. Irony doesn't die in conquest, it just changes uniforms. The very flowers once demanded for imperial tribute are now considered frivolous by men in armor, who don't understand their sacred role. You see a boy yanked from a canoe for spending too long arranging amaranth. Too pretty, the overseer says. Not productive. You want to argue, but the boy is already gone. And here's the twist. The Spanish do try to improve things. They introduce livestock, pigs, goats, even cows. The goats eat everything, including the delicate reeds holding the chinampa edges. The pigs churn soil into useless sludge. The cows trample canal banks, collapse berms, and fill waterways with excrement. The Spaniards congratulate themselves on importing progress, while Chinampros watch centuries of ecological knowledge get stomped into the lake. They also try draining the lake. No, really. The Viceroyalty funds drainage tunnels to lower water levels, making land easier to claim and develop in European terms. The lake fights back. Floods increase. Mosquitoes thrive. And yet the engineers persist, scribbling notes in leather-bound journals as if water were a problem to be solved, not a partner to be respected. Quirky fact. Some Spanish priests, ironically, became unexpected allies. A few saw the chinampas as biblical gardens, Edenic almost. They advocated for preserving them, recording their construction methods in elaborate codices. One friar wrote that the floating gardens were the closest thing to divine order man. Half-constructed. Sadly, his report was shelved in favor of military fortification plans. But his admiration stands as a rare echo of appreciation in a sea of disregard. Historians still argue about whether the collapse of the chinampa system was intentional or incidental. Was it the deliberate strategy of colonial erasure, or the slow grinding down of a culture misread and misused? Most now agree it was both. The Spanish didn't need to burn every chinampa, they just needed to misunderstand them long enough for time and neglect to do the rest. You pass a former inspection, post now a storage dock for tax grain. The stone calendar that once marked agricultural cycles is covered in moss. A pig roots nearby. The water around the dock is stagnant, covered in algae. You remember it flowing. You remember the laughter, the silent bartering, the poetry gardens, the drums. It all feels distant now, like a melody you can't quite place. But not all is lost. Some farmers resist, not with weapons, but with routines. You meet one man, wrinkled like a water-worn stone, who's still dredging muck by hand. He doesn't speak to his overseer, doesn't attend mass, just tends his plot the way his grandfather taught him. He says the soil still remembers, that if you layer it right and plant before the first storm, it will forgive you. His chinampa, though smaller, is thriving maize, beans, squash, and even a stubborn row of marigolds. When asked why he still grows flowers, he shrugs. The gods may have left, he says, but they still check in sometimes. You drift deeper into the southern chinampa zones, those furthest from colonial eyes, and see scattered plots quietly resisting time. No temples, no officials. Just small, stubborn networks of chinampas trying to maintain structure. Women use broken pottery as seed markers. Children patch canal walls with stolen church banners. Someone has repurposed a Spanish wine barrel into a compost bin. The ingenuity survives even when the system doesn't, and there's something poetic. Here, if painful, a civilization didn't collapse overnight. It eroded, not with fire, but with pressure. Language, labor, land redefined slowly until people forgot what came before. And yet, you float past these fragments, these ghosts of a greater garden, and realize that even when systems fail, memory blooms, in technique, in texture, in the simple act of planting one more seed dot as you round the bend back toward the main canal. A storm is rising again, not in the sky this time, but in your chest. You understand now that the collapse wasn't just political. It was personal. The chinampa system didn't vanish, it was unraveled, strand by strand, reed by reed. And those who remembered how it once worked, they're not just farmers. They're archivists of mud, curators of a lost collaboration between humans and water. You arrive now at Texcoco, not the ancient Texcoco, goddess of flowers, but the neighborhood that bears her name. It is the last breath of the old chinampa system, stubbornly floating in the concrete sprawl of modern Mexico City, like a ghost that never got the memo. Your canoe now makes way among painted Trajanera's flat-bottomed party boats with speakers, umbrellas, and tourists holding mecheladas like cultural amnesia. The water still flows. The canals still exist, but the function has changed. You drift through the ruins of an ecological machine, now wrapped in music and selfie sticks. And somehow it still pulses. Beneath the mariachi chords and laughter, you see it. Chinampas still survive here, not all of them, not as they once were, but in pockets, like fragments of an ancient spell. Some have been fully converted to gardens for pleasure. Others, hidden further back from the main drag, are still worked by families who trace their lineage back through the sludge, generation by generation. You meet one such man, Don Emilio, who gestures to his plot with pride. This land was stolen by everyone and everything, he says, but it still grows. He grows maize, sure, but also chiles, herbs, even amaranth. Not for tribute. Not for empire, for market, for himself. For the memory. Don Emilio's chinampa looks deceptively normal. Crooked fences, willow trees, and a canal that stinks a little on hot days. But look closer. His maize rows are spaced for drainage, his beans interwoven to stabilize stalks. The edges of the chinampa are braced with salvaged metal grates, rebar, even broken PVC piping, all used to compensate for the lack of young ajo trees. This isn't innovation. It's desperation rebranded as adaptation. And yet, it works. His produce wins awards at the local market. His soil is rich. His canal doesn't flood. Here's your quirky fact. Modern chinampas often use a mix of ancient and contemporary tools, obsidian blades for harvesting herbs, but plastic buckets for dredging muck. One uses a kiddie pool to rinse his amaranth. Another swears by a retired laundry basket as the perfect dredge filter. Historians and agronomists come to study their methods. Eco-activists arrive with notepads and hope. No one leaves unimpressed, yet the threats are many. Pollution is constant runoff from nearby roads, dumped trash, sewage overflow. You pass one canal where the water is thick with algae bloom. A dog barks from a chinampa rooftop as a plastic bottle bobs past. There are signs warning people not to swim, not to fish. You can't help but notice they weren't needed centuries ago. But it's not just the water. It's the encroachment. Every year, new developments nibble closer. Housing, stores, illegal roads that crack the edge of the wetlands like invasive roots. The city creeps forward, and every chinampa that disappears takes with it more than just crops. It takes language, ritual, continuity. Historians still argue whether the chinampa system in Texcoco is a relic or a rebirth. Some call it an endangered ecosystem. Others call it an experimental zone for urban agriculture. But if you ask the people who still plant here, they'll tell you it's neither. This is our grandmother's blood, one woman tells you, standing knee-deep in weeds. We keep it moving, or it dries up. You stop at a small community cooperative. There, growing not just food, but education. Schools bring students here to learn how to plant, how to dredge, how to listen to the soil. It's not just science. It's reculturing. A boy, maybe 8, explains how chinampa trees help prevent erosion. A girl shows you her bean trellis and explains which beans sing the loudest in the wind. You laugh, but she's not joking. These kids are learning to speak a language older than the city that suffocates them. And they speak it fluently. In one corner, you see something truly strange. A drone, hovering, buzzing, scanning the plots. It belongs to a researcher from UNAM, who's using it to map soil degradation and track water quality. He's hopeful. Says they've found sections of canals still miraculously clean. Plots still functioning as they did 500 years ago. It's not much, but it's proof. Chinampas don't need to be remembered. They can be restored. You meet artists, 2 musicians recording reed flute samples among the willows, dancers rehearsing, rituals in the mud, muralists painting gods onto canal walls. It's not just farming, it's revival, it's resurrection. It's what happens when memory refuses to become mere nostalgia. When people take what was lost and say, not yet. There's even a campaign, Chinampa 2.0, funded by Urban Agriculture. Groups designed to reintroduce floating farming into other cities around the world. Bangkok, Lagos, New Orleans. Places where water meets hardship. They see in the chinampa not just heritage, but blueprint. A scalable, replicable model of self-sustaining, hyper-local food production. The future, it seems, floats. And yet, as night falls and the boats return home, you still feel the ghosts. You see them in the silhouettes of trees that no longer grow. You hear them in the splash of paddles through polluted water. You smell them in the soil, where amaranth still rises defiantly, reaching toward a moon that has watched this system rise, fall, and rise again.
There's a heaviness to the water tonight as your canoe slips farther down one of the quieter side canals, away from the bright lights and tangled speaker wires of the Texcoco party boats. Past the music, the laughter, the artificial buzz of tourism pasted over history like a smiling sticker. Here, in the deeper waters, the chinampas narrow into quieter zones, where farmers don't perform for tourists and the reeds don't pose for photographs. This is where something different is happening, something stranger, more deliberate, and maybe just a little futuristic, because here, on these ancient floating islands, the ghosts of the Aztecs are collaborating with a new generation of dreamers, hackers, and dirt romantics who think maybe the future isn't steel and concrete but compost and root systems. You're introduced to a small collective of chinampa caretakers who don't look like anyone you've seen before on this journey. One wears a faded Metallica shirt under his work apron, Another has wireless earbuds and while carefully layering soil over a tray of microgreens. A third is scanning a QR code printed on a laminated post stuck into a reed fence. You've landed in the realm of the chinampa revivalists, the ones who blend ancient knowledge with modern tools, who quote both Nahuatl proverbs and soil pH data in the same breath. They don't see these floating gardens as quaint relics, they see them as prototypes for survival. One of them, her name's Yanni, and she's both an ecologist and a techno-shaman, apparently walks you through the new system. Her chinampa is GPS mapped and climate monitored via a solar-powered sensor cluster built from hacked smartphone parts. The data feeds into an app she developed with friends from the university. It tells her when the soil is too acidic, when canal water is getting stagnant, when the wind is strong enough to require extra root anchors. She still dredges muck by hand, but logs the results in a spreadsheet that predicts future yields. Her compost pile is tagged with biodegradable or FID chips to measure decomposition rates. You ask her if it still feels like farming. She says, nah, it feels like debugging the earth. Quirky fact time. This collective even has a chinampa server, a waterproof Raspberry Pi stashed inside a hollowed-out gourd mounted to a tree. It serves as a Wi-Fi hotspot and digital archive for everything they've recorded, planting cycles, harvest yields, audio interviews with elderly China pros, even 3D scan models of pre-Columbian tools. When you connect to it, it pings your phone with a simple welcome message, Plaza Kamati. You've entered the garden of memory. You're not sure whether to laugh or cry, so you just nod and accept the data packet. Historians have started paying attention, so have agronomists, climate scientists, urban planners. The chinampa system, long ignored as indigenous heritage to niche to scale, is suddenly being reconsidered, with droughts tightening their grip on global food systems, with cities choking on pavement. The floating garden seems less like a curiosity and more like a solution we left behind. The revivalists know this. They've started teaching workshops chinampa 101 for city kids, DIY water filtration using native reed species, even ritual classes led by local elders who teach how to speak to maize before planting it. It's not nostalgia, it's repair, but the revival is fragile. The land, if you can call it that, is threatened from every angle. Development pressure, illegal dumping, political disinterest, and, of course, time itself. The canal walls erode. Faster now, as boats grow larger and faster, climate change has altered rainfall patterns, making traditional planting calendars harder to trust. One elder, Don Chava, tells you he used to feel the soil breathe before a storm. Now it just sweats and stays silent. He still plants, but says he doesn't sing to the beans anymore, not because they don't deserve it, but because the wind doesn't listen like it used to. Still, the movement grows. There are rooftop gardens in the city that mimic chinampa, layouts layered boxes with reed beds, wet compost cores, and willow cuttings nurtured in buckets. Restaurants now source ingredients from chinampa farms and proudly printed on menus. 100% from the lake. Tourists pay for voluntourism days, where they get to dig through wet soil and pretend they're reviving an empire. Most last and are. A few stay longer. Some never leave. You meet one who arrived from Canada 5 years ago and now speaks fluent Nahuatl and runs a worm composting project using techniques he learned from 11th century manuscripts and Reddit forums. There's even a growing philosophy among the revivalists, a way of thinking about time and ecology that's less linear and more spiral. They say the chinampa system didn't end. It just submerged, and now it's surfacing again, carrying old seeds in new hands. One artist has painted a mural on a canal wall, a chinampa rising like a whale from the water, trailing flowers from its back, with people planting corn on its spine. Beneath it reads a single phrase in bold white paint, still floating. You float back through this quiet zone as night creeps in. The air smells of damp earth and fermenting blossoms. You hear frogs begin their low chorus again, and far in the distance, a flute player rehearses a melody you recognize from somewhere deep in this story. The moon hangs over the canal like a paper lantern, and for a moment, you feel that the chinampa doesn't belong to history, it belongs to rhythm, breath. Resilience. Maybe the revivalists are right. Maybe the world doesn't need a new idea. Maybe it just needs to listen better to the old ones. You close your eyes and let the water rock you gently, 1,000 years of human hands woven into the waves beneath you. You're drifting now through the last stretch of water, the final breath of the journey, and it's quiet almost unnaturally so. The reeds bow gently in the breeze. The canals gleam under the early hush of dawn, and every now and then, a splash echoes from nowhere, like the lake remembering itself. The chinampas stand still, not dead, just resting, but you know they're not just beds of soil. They're storylines, floating archives that refuse to sink entirely. And tonight you're reading their last chapter for now, because nothing in this place ever ends. It just keeps moving, in loops of water and mud and memory. Your canoe passes by an elderly woman in a bright blue shawl. She doesn't look at you. What she's planting with methodical grace maize seeds dropped one by one into black soil as rich as chocolate cake, her fingers moving in rhythm like a song you can't hear, but somehow know. She's not in a hurry. No one ever is when they know the soil won't betray them. And that's the real lesson of the chinampa. When you treat the land like a partner, it remembers, it forgives, it grows with you, not for you. The chinampa system, this entire world of floating order, was never just about survival. It was about intimacy between humans and nature, between gods and mud, between sun and water. The farmers didn't just feed the city, they held it aloft. The empire may have crowned warriors, carved temple, written glyphs into stone, but it was the chinampas that carried it all like quiet lungs under a showy voice. And even after collapse, colonization, pollution, and neglect, they persisted. Not because someone told them to, but because someone refused to forget. That is resistance. That is memory. You float past a chinampa covered in nothing but flowers white, sip a skill, orange cosmos, and a few stray dahlias. It's not farming season. This is a memorial, a field grown purely to remember those who kept this system alive. You see wooden placards in the mud with carved names, some modern, some ancient. You don't recognize them, but the lake does. And somehow, that feels like enough. You pass a boy on a small canoe, no older than 10, paddling with one hand and balancing a tray of seedlings with the other. He's whistling, not to himself, but to the birds. They answer. You wonder if he knows he's paddling through the ribs of a fallen civilization. You wonder if it matters, because he's not surviving it, he's continuing it. Historians still argue about what exactly the chinampa system represents. Some call it the pinnacle of pre-industrial agriculture, a model of ecological perfection. Others see it as a cultural artifact, frozen in the amber of empire. But here, tonight, you know it as something simpler, a whisper, a soft, persistent whisper from the past, saying we once did this, and we can do it again. The wind picks up slightly. You tighten your blanket, lean into the soft creak of the canoe, and let yourself drift into the stillness. The water mirrors the sky, now soft blue melting into softer gray. As the first light of morning stretches its fingers across the lake, you've been here for hours, days, centuries, or maybe just a heartbeat. You think about the empire, the collapse, the mud, the maize, the Spanish, the plastic, the drones, the school children, the prayers, the QR codes, the fish bones, the poetry, readings, the composting toilets, the floating pigs, the flower revolutions, the burn altars, and the scientist with the waterproof laptop. You think about all of it and realize it was never boring. It was never lost. It was just underwater, waiting. And now, finally, it's time to rest. Let your breath soften now, like the reeds dipping into the water. Imagine the hush of the lake, the gentle rhythm of distant paddles, the birdsong rising slowly into the dawn. You are floating still, carried by centuries of soft labor, gentle rituals, and stories pass hand to hand, seed to seed. The air is damp and warm around you, filled with the scent of wet earth, the faint sweetness of marigold, and the cool mist of morning just beginning to form. You've journeyed through an empire built on water and willpower, where farmers wore mud like armor and the gods lived in the soil. You've drifted past invention and collapse, memory and revival, always rocking gently in the arms of the chinampas. They held up cities, they held up stories, and now they're holding you, so let your eyes close. Let the paddles slow. Let the soft hum of the night, the fan in your room, the rhythm of your breath, carry you into that quiet canal where everything floats, but nothing is lost. You are not sinking. You are remembering, and tomorrow, maybe you'll wake with dirt under your fingernails and a few words of nahuatl resting on your tongue. But for now, you are still, safe, floating, dreaming. End of script. Sweet dreams.